When you imagine the Vikings, the first image that likely comes to mind is not one of quiet writing. You may picture ships slicing through icy waters, sails puffed with northern winds, or axes clashing against wooden shields. Yet behind those fierce impressions lies a quieter story, the way the Vikings wrote, and more curiously, the material they used for their words. The Vikings, active from roughly the late 8th to the early 11th century, lived in a world where parchment was rare, paper was nearly non-existent in Europe, and stone was heavy and costly to carve. And so, for ordinary records, messages, or small expressions of thought, they turned to something humbler: wooden sticks. The writing system they used was runic, a series of angular letters adapted for carving into resistant surfaces like wood, bone, or stone. These runes were not just symbols for sounds. They carried deep cultural significance tied to myth and magic, yet they were also functional. The runes, scratched into wood, carried messages both practical and personal. Wood was abundant in Scandinavia. Birch, ash, pine, and oak filled the forests of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and each tree gave its wood particular qualities. Birch bark, thin and pliable, could be peeled into sheets, suitable for ink or etching. Pine, softer than oak, took the knife's edge more easily. Oak, though harder, carried a prestige and durability that made it suitable for more serious or formal writings. Imagine for a moment a Viking pulling a small knife from his belt, taking a fallen branch, trimming it smooth, and then carefully etching runes onto its surface. The practicality of the wooden stick went beyond convenience. Unlike stone inscriptions, which were fixed in place and meant to endure for generations, these sticks carried information that was temporary. They could be messages passed along, accounts of trade, simple notes, or even casual graffiti. In Bergen, Norway, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of such runic inscriptions on wood, dating from the 12th and 13th centuries. Some of these inscriptions are mundane, almost laughably so: notes of credit, shopping lists, declarations of affection, insults, or jokes. They show us not the lofty world of sagas and kings, but the daily exchanges of ordinary people who lived, worked, and traded in the wooden towns of the north. One particularly striking example comes from Bergen's Bryggen district, where fire and water preserved layers of timber buildings. Amid those ruins, archaeologists found slender sticks marked with runes. Some bore the words of merchants' lists of goods amounts owed, or instructions for delivery. Others contained names, reminders, or brief messages of longing. In one case, a stick recorded words of love: "Kiss me, I am yours." In another, it carried a curse: "May you be ill until you come to me." Such messages remind us that Vikings were not only warriors, but also people whose hearts, debts, and obligations pressed upon them in ordinary ways. Still, writing on wood was not unique to Scandinavia. Other cultures had used wood for writing long before the Viking Age. The Romans wrote on wooden tablets covered in wax, scratching notes with a stylus. In Central Asia, birch bark manuscripts recorded Buddhist teachings. In China, bamboo slips carried characters before paper spread widely. What makes the Viking use of wooden sticks remarkable is the combination of runic tradition, everyday pragmatism, and the survival of these fragile objects in damp soil. Without the preservation of Bergen's wooden foundations, much of this written record would have rotted away, leaving us to imagine the Vikings as illiterate raiders, rather than practical scribes of their own daily affairs. It is important to remember that literacy in the Viking Age was uneven. Not everyone could carve runes with fluency, and yet the very existence of these sticks suggests that more people knew how to write than one might assume. Carving a rune did not require a formal education, as did the Latin script taught in monasteries. Instead, It required familiarity with a set of symbols and enough confidence to cut them into wood. This ease of access allowed runes to spread beyond the control of elites. Farmers, traders, and travelers could make use of them. A runic stick could be a letter at tally, or even a charm. The choice of wood as a medium also reflected a different relationship with writing itself. Today, you might expect written words to endure preserved on paper stored in books, or archived in digital files. For the Vikings, writing could be impermanent, more like speech than like record. A wooden stick might carry its message for days, weeks, or months, and then decay, burn, or be discarded. Its survival into this present is an accident, a quirk of preservation. To study them is to glimpse not the grand narrative, but the fragile traces of ordinary thought. The archaeological finds also reveal technical details. The sticks were usually shaped to a flat surface, sometimes split from larger pieces of wood, sometimes whittled thin. Their size varied. Some were short and easily carried, others longer and more substantial. Carving was done with a knife, often leaving angled cuts typical of rune making. The letters themselves slanted or leaned depending on the grain of the wood, and sometimes the carver made mistakes reversing or omitting runes, suggesting that this was not the work of professional scribes, but of ordinary hands. And yet, for all their plainness, these wooden sticks open up worlds of interpretation. Were they messages left behind for others to find? Were they carried in pockets or pouches like folded notes? Did they serve as receipts for transactions, kept until debts were settled? Or were they sometimes no more than idle scratches, a way to pass the time in a marketplace or workshop? The survival of these artifacts also tells us something about the environment of medieval towns. Bergen's damp earth, sealed by layers of rebuilding, after fires created anaerobic conditions in which wood could survive for centuries. Without that unique setting, the messages would have been lost, and we would know far less about how ordinary Vikings used writing. As you picture these sticks lying buried for nearly 1,000 years, it becomes clear how fragile our connection to the past can be. A single fire, a shift in soil, or a different pattern of decay, and those words would be gone forever. What we see today is not the full record, but a fragment of what once was, a partial chorus of voices, enough to remind us that even in the Viking Age, ordinary people reached for words. But one question lingers. If these were everyday messages written quickly and easily on wood, how many more might once have existed messages that were never meant to last and yet carried the weight of daily life? Section 2, Words in a World of Trade and Travel. When we think about the Vikings, we often imagine them as raiders descending on foreign shores in swift ships. Yet the reality of their lives was just as much about trade, negotiation, and exchange as it was about warfare. And in the midst of that exchange, written communication on humble wooden sticks found its place. The Viking Age was a time of great mobility. From the fjords of Norway and the coasts of Denmark, ships sailed not only westward to the British Isles, Iceland, and Greenland, but also eastward along the rivers of Russia, deep into the lands of the Slavs and Byzantines. To travel was to risk, and to risk was to deal in trust and agreement. Words mattered. Promises, contracts, records of debt, all had weight in a society where the movement of goods was constant. And yet for a society that prized oral tradition, where sagas were memorized and recited, and where laws were spoken aloud by a law speaker at assemblies, why did some turn to writing? The answer seems to lie in the practical needs of commerce and daily affairs. Oral agreements could be remembered, but memory faltered and disputes arose. A wooden stick scratched with runes could serve as a record, a physical reminder of what was owed, agreed upon, or delivered. Take, for example, the Bergen runic finds. Among them are tally sticks, carved with marks that seem to record amounts of goods. Some may have functioned as receipts split between two parties, so that each held a piece of wood with matching cuts. Others bore names, perhaps reminders of who had borrowed or promised payment. These are not the words of sagas or kings, but of merchants and townsfolk people whose daily survival depended on keeping accounts straight. The choice of wood was again significant. It was cheap, abundant, and disposable. Unlike stone monuments, which declared permanence, or vellum manuscripts which required costly animal skins, wooden sticks were immediate and practical. They could be cut from scraps, carved quickly, and discarded when no longer needed. In this sense, they were much like the paper notes and receipts we use today, ephemeral, fragile, yet meaningful in their moment. But writing on wood was not limited to merchants. There are hints of personal and emotional uses as well. The runic inscriptions sometimes include expressions of affection, insults, or charms. One inscription found in Bergen reads like a declaration of love, another like a private joke. These reveal that runes were not confined to the marketplace, but slipped into the spaces of private thought and feeling. Just as you might scribble a note, carve initials into a desk, or send a brief message today, so too did these people reach for small pieces of wood to capture their words. We can imagine the context: a young man in a bustling Bergen marketplace, carving a stick with runes, handing it to a friend with a message to deliver. A woman in a household using a stick to keep track of household goods, marking tallies as she distributes grain or cloth. A trader writing down a reminder of what he must collect upon returning from a voyage. A servant perhaps slipping a carved insult into the possession of a rival. A crude joke left in a place where it would be found. The very ordinariness of these uses is what makes them so compelling. They bring us close to daily Viking life in ways that sagas and chronicles cannot. The sagas tell of kings, warriors, and voyages, but the runic sticks tell of errands, debts, feelings, and jokes. They are the forgotten paperwork of a society that, for all its grandeur, relied on small details to function. Yet it is worth considering the limits of this writing. Literacy was not universal even in its basic runic form. While more widespread than the formal Latin literacy of monasteries, runic writing still required knowledge and skill. Archaeologists suggest that perhaps 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 people in Viking Age towns may have been able to carve runes with confidence. This meant that writing carried a kind of social weight. It was accessible but not trivial. To send a message on a stick was to assume that the recipient could read it, or knew someone who could. This reliance on writing for practical matters also highlights the flexibility of runes. Unlike the Roman alphabet designed for ink on parchment, runes were angular and suited for carving. Their shapes minimized curves, making them easier to inscribe with a knife or awl. The word rune itself carried associations with mystery and secrecy, drawn from the Old Norse rune, meaning a secret or whisper. Thus, even as runes functioned for mundane writing, they carried echoes of deeper cultural meaning. To carve a rune was to inscribe both a sound and a symbol, with magical overtones, even if the intent was no more than to record 2 barrels of fish. This dual nature, ordinary and symbolic, reflects the Viking way of balancing practicality with belief. In a world where God's omens and fate were woven into daily life, even a tally stick could carry a kind of resonance. Some inscriptions blur the line, appearing half practical, half magical. A stick might contain a simple message on one side and a protective charm on the other. This layering suggests that writing was not seen as purely mundane, but as something that connected practical affairs with a larger, unseen world. The wider context of trade, further magnifies the importance of such writing. Bergen, where so many sticks were found, was a hub of commerce, a place where Hanseatic merchants would later dominate, and where Norse traders gathered long before. Ships brought stockfish from northern Norway, hides and wool from Iceland, grain from Denmark, and luxury goods from afar. To manage these flows, merchants needed tools of record. Writing on wooden sticks was one of those tools. Think, too, of the distances involved. A trader might set out across the North Sea hoping to sell his goods in England or Friesland. Agreements made at home had to be remembered upon return. A wooden stick inscribed with a reminder might survive the voyage in a pouch or chest, acting as a silent companion across hundreds of miles. The stick itself was modest, but the distances it traveled and the weight of obligation it carried were immense. And so we begin to see the runic stick not just as an object, but as a participant in Viking life. It mediated trust, memory, and obligation. It carried words between people. It survived where speech might fade. It helped knit together a society in motion, stretched across seas and rivers, but bound by the need to remember who owed what, who promised what, and who cared enough to say, "I am yours." Yet, one question remains unresolved. If so many of these sticks served such crucial roles, what does it mean that only a handful have survived? How much of Viking daily writing has been lost to time, leaving us with just fragments? And how different might our picture of their world be if we could read the countless words that once existed? Section 3. The Afterlife of Words. The survival of Viking wooden writing sticks is, in many ways, a miracle of accident. They were never meant to endure. Unlike rune stones, which were carved in granite to proclaim memory for centuries, the slim wooden sticks were intended for short lives. They were receipts, notes, jokes, reminders, or charms, ephemeral as breath. And yet, because of firewater and layers of rebuilding, some of them slipped into preservation, buried in the damp earth of towns like Bergen. When archaeologists began uncovering them in the 20th century, they did not immediately grasp their significance. Wooden fragments seemed fragile, often broken, sometimes warped. Many were dismissed as debris, at first unremarkable scraps of an old town. But as runes became visible on their surfaces, the reality emerged. These were messages from the Viking world, direct and unfiltered words, once held in living hands. The discovery transformed our picture of Norse society. Before the Bergen fine scholars often assumed that literacy was limited to elites, that writing in runes was ceremonial or magical, rather than practical. The sagas recorded in Iceland, centuries after the events they described, had given us stories of heroes, kings, and law speakers, but little evidence of ordinary people writing in their daily lives. The wooden sticks changed that. They showed that writing was not rare, nor confined to the powerful. Ordinary townsfolk, merchants, artisans, and likely even servants were carving words into wood to navigate their daily worlds. Consider the significance of a shopping list carved into a stick. It may seem trivial, almost boring, but its very existence tells us something profound. It shows that literacy was woven into daily life in ways that had previously been invisible. It suggests that in a bustling town, at least some portion of the population could both write and read. And it tells us that writing was not solely for the preservation of sagas or the recording of laws, but also for buying fish, managing grain, and remembering errands. The inscriptions also bring us closer to the humor and humanity of their authors. One stick records a playful verse. Another carries an insult so sharp it might be called graffiti today. These fragments show us not solemn Norsemen reciting Eddas, but people laughing, joking, and teasing each other. Writing was not just a tool of trade, but a medium for personal expression. Through these small scratches in wood, the Vikings emerged not as distant raiders, but as neighbors, co-workers, and companions, ordinary people finding ways to leave words behind. At the same time, some sticks do point to deeper or more symbolic uses. A few contain charms, short invocations meant to protect or heal. Others repeat simple rune patterns, perhaps as practice or perhaps as a kind of magical formula. This blend of practical and mystical writing is telling. It shows that runes never lost their association with mystery, even as they served mundane purposes. For the Vikings, writing was never entirely ordinary. It carried echoes of the sacred even when it was used to tally a debt. The sticks also remind us of the fragility of history. For every piece of wood that survived, countless others decayed into soil, burned in hearths, or were carried away by water. What we hold today is a fragment of a fragment, a narrow glimpse through a door that is mostly closed. Imagine the thousands of notes, contracts, and messages that once passed through Viking towns. Imagine the words of people whose names we will never know, whose thoughts disappeared with the rotting of their wooden slips. The surviving sticks are both a treasure and a reminder of how much is lost. This raises questions about how we understand the past. Too often, history is told through the lens of the powerful kings, warriors, priests, and poets. The wooden sticks shift that perspective. They give us the handwriting, so to speak, of ordinary people. They show that literacy, trade, humor, and love were not confined to elites, but spread through towns and markets. They give us a ground-level view of life in the Viking Age, one where debts and jokes mattered as much as battles and voyages. Modern scholars use these finds to reconsider Viking society. They suggest that the culture of towns like Bergen was more complex than previously imagined. The economy required not only traders and sailors, but also record keepers and readers. The presence of personal notes suggests that literacy may have extended into the household, and the blending of practical and magical inscriptions reminds us that worldviews were never neatly divided into secular and sacred. The sticks also carry lessons for today. They remind us that the survival of words is fragile, dependent on chance. Our own messages, texts, receipts, notes may seem more permanent, stored in clouds or printed in ink, but they too may vanish. Future historians may one day wonder about us in the same way we wonder about the Vikings. What words have been lost and what chance survivals remain? Think of how different our image of the Vikings would be without these discoveries. We might still imagine them primarily as illiterate warriors defined by raids and battles. Instead, we see them as a people who, in the midst of trade, love, debt, and humor, reached for simple sticks of wood to carve their words. That small act of carving changes the scale of their humanity. So, when you picture a Viking, now do not only see the warrior with an axe. See instead a person sitting by a fire knife in hand, carving words into a sliver of wood. The stick may be small, but the act is significant. It is the act of making memory tangible, of capturing thought, of sending a message into the world. And though most of those sticks are lost, a few have survived, and in their survival, they whisper across centuries. Yet even with these discoveries, one thought lingers unresolved. If we have only fragments, how much more lies buried waiting to be found, and how much has slipped beyond recovery forever? Story 2. The tax records of ancient Egypt. How bureaucracy built an empire. Section 1. The birth of bureaucracy along the Nile. If you picture ancient Egypt, perhaps you see pyramids gleaming under the desert sun, pharaohs adorned with crowns of gold, or temples lined with colossal statues. Yet behind these grand monuments lay an invisible machine, the bureaucracy that kept Egypt functioning for more than 2,000 years. And at the heart of that machine were tax records. To build pyramids, to raise armies, to fund temples, or even to keep the Nile's flood-fed farmlands productive, Egypt needed organization. The kingdom's wealth came not from mines or trade alone, but primarily from agriculture. The Nile's annual flood deposited fertile silt, transforming desert into farmland. Wheat, barley, flax, vegetables, and papyrus grew in abundance, but abundance required management. How much grain would each village provide to the state, who was responsible for delivering it? How were surpluses stored, and who recorded the amounts? These questions shaped the rhythm of Egyptian society. The Egyptians answered with bureaucracy. From the earliest dynasties, scribes, educated men trained in the art of writing, kept detailed accounts of production, taxation, and distribution. Their medium was papyrus, a plant abundant in the Nile marshes, cut into strips and pressed into sheets. On these sheets, written in black and red ink, scribes recorded the lifeblood of the state lists of households, inventories of grain, tallies of cattle, records of work obligations. Without such records, the pharaoh's government could not have built monuments, fed laborers, or maintained armies. The oldest surviving examples of Egyptian writing dating back over 5,000 years are not poems or myths, but administrative notes, tallies of goods, lists of names, marks of ownership. Writing itself emerged as a tool of administration, a way to give permanence to memory and accountability to obligation. A scribe's neat lines of hieroglyphs or hieratic script transformed spoken agreements into fixed records. This was the essence of Egyptian bureaucracy, the transformation of produce and labor into lines of ink that could be counted, stored, and recalled. Imagine the process. The Nile floods, and as the waters recede, farmers sow their crops. At harvest, scribes arrive in villages carrying writing boards and rolls of papyrus. They count the sheaves of grain, tally the herds of cattle, and record how much each household owes in tax. These taxes are collected not in coin. Egypt had little currency in the early dynastic and Old Kingdom periods, but in kind grain, livestock, flax oil, or labor. Grain was especially important, as it could be stored in vast state granaries and redistributed to workers, soldiers, or artisans. The act of record-keeping was not merely technical. It was political. Taxation bound the population to the state. Every household owed a share of its produce or labor to the pharaoh, and every scribe's record ensured that obligation was enforced. To be unrecorded was to be invisible to the state, but to be recorded was to carry responsibility. In this sense, writing created a network of control that stretched from the royal court to the smallest village. It is striking how detailed these records could be. Surviving papyri, ostraca potsherds used for notes and inscriptions, show a bureaucracy that tracked the minutiae of life. In some documents, we find lists of workers on construction projects, complete with absences noted and reasons given. On this day, absent brewing beer, or absent bitten by a scorpion. Other records detail inventories of temple goods, tallies of offerings, or audits of local officials. Such details may seem dull, but they reveal a society where order and accountability mattered deeply. Behind these records stood the scribes themselves. To be a scribe was to hold power not through physical force, but through knowledge. Few Egyptians could read or write. Literacy was concentrated in the hands of this trained class. Scribes spent years learning the hundreds of signs that made up hieroglyphs and the faster cursive hieratic script used for everyday administration. Their status was high, often exempt from manual labor, and rewarded with stable positions in the bureaucracy. An ancient text, the Satire of the Trades, describes the scribe's life as superior to all others, contrasting it with the hardships of farming, fishing, or soldiering. A scribe with his pen and ink wielded influence disproportionate to his physical tools. And yet, even for scribes, the work could be tedious. Copying lists of grain, tallying taxes, recording labor duties, these tasks required patience and precision. The monotony of administration, so essential for the functioning of the state, was built on the quiet labor of thousands of hands and eyes. To read these records today is to enter into their world, one of numbers, names, and obligations where greatness was built not only by kings and architects, but also by clerks with pens of reed and ink made of soot. Consider the pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for Pharaoh Khufu around 2500 BCE, required an enormous workforce. Feeding, housing, and organizing that workforce demanded careful planning. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages near Giza shows that rations of bread, beer, and meat were distributed regularly. These rations were calculated and recorded. Without tax records to supply the grain, and livestock, without scribes to account for distribution, such monumental construction would have been impossible. The pyramid may seem eternal, but its foundation was laid as much in ink as in stone. The reach of bureaucracy extended into temples as well. Priests oversaw vast estates dedicated to the gods, and these estates generated wealth in crops and livestock. Records of offerings, temple inventories, and landholdings have survived, showing how religion and administration intertwined. To serve the gods was also to manage their accounts, ensuring that proper quantities of grain, beer, and incense reached the temples on time. The very rhythm of Egyptian life, tied to the Nile's floods, was mirrored in the rhythm of record-keeping. Each year's inundation set the cycle: planting, harvesting, taxation, redistribution. The bureaucracy followed this cycle, collecting data, storing goods, and releasing them when needed. In times of good harvest, the system ensured surplus. In times of famine, records allowed officials to manage reserves, though not always effectively. The resilience of Egypt's civilization lasting millennia owed much to this system of accountability. Yet, for all its strength, bureaucracy had its costs. To be taxed meant to surrender a share of one's labor and produce. Peasants often bore the heaviest burdens delivering grain or working on state projects. For them, the scribe's pen was not a neutral tool, but a symbol of obligation. Tax records were both the glue that held society together and the weight that pressed upon its people. As you imagine the quiet rustle of papyrus, the scratch of reed pens, and the orderly lists of grain and cattle, one question lingers. How did this system of writing and taxation, so detailed and so vast, adapt over centuries as Egypt's kingdoms rose and fell? Section 2. Counting grain, counting people. The strength of the Egyptian state was not measured only in monuments or armies, but in its ability to count. To govern a land stretching hundreds of miles along the Nile required more than royal decrees or religious authority. It required the ability to measure, track, and organize. In this sense, taxation was not simply a burden on the people, but the backbone of administration. Every year, after the Nile's waters receded and crops ripened, scribes and officials set out to assess the harvest. This was no casual inspection. Teams of record-keepers, overseers, and local administrators moved from village to village, noting how many fields had been planted, how much grain had been gathered, and how much must be sent to state granaries. The process was thorough, and the documentation extensive. Some of the best evidence for this system comes from the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom periods, when papyrus documents and inscriptions detailed tax assessments. The so-called Wilbur Papyrus, dating from the reign of Ramesses V in the 12th century BCE, is a striking example. Over 10 meters long, it lists lands, their owners, their locations, and their obligations. The level of detail is remarkable. Each parcel of land is identified, its measurements, given its tax liability noted. Reading it today feels less like reading an ancient artifact and more like leafing through a modern property register. This papyrus and others like it show how deeply bureaucratic the Egyptian state had become. Taxation was not arbitrary, but codified, written down in ways that allowed for audits and accountability. Officials could check records, compare obligations, and enforce collections. The state's reach extended into every field and village, translating agricultural abundance into grain for the treasury workers, for construction, and provisions for the army. The methods of collection varied. In some periods, taxes were collected primarily in kind sacks of grain, herds of cattle, jars of oil. In other periods, especially when foreign trade expanded, taxes could also be collected in silver or other goods of exchange. Labor was another common form of tax. Villagers were required to contribute days of work on state projects, whether building canals, temples, or monuments. Such corvée labor, though not voluntary, was essential to the great works of Egyptian civilization. The administration of taxation required not only scribes, but also overseers. Local officials, often drawn from the elite families of each region, were responsible for ensuring that villages met their obligations. Above them, higher officials in provincial capitals coordinated records and passed them upward. At the apex stood the vizier, the pharaoh's chief administrator, who supervised the flow of resources from countryside to palace, temple, and army. The Egyptians also developed methods of verification. Grain collected in taxes was stored in massive state granaries, where further tallies were made. Measuring rods and standardized containers ensured consistency. Reliefs on temple walls sometimes depict scribes standing with tallies in hand, while laborers pour grain into storage jars, a visual record of the system at work. The act of measuring was itself a ritual of authority, transforming private harvest into public resources. But taxation was not only about grain. Censuses of people and livestock were also carried out, sometimes referred to as cattle counts. These counts were vital, not only for assessing wealth, but also for reaffirming the king's authority. In the Old Kingdom, the cattle count was so central that it was sometimes used as a way of dating reigns. Events were noted as occurring in the year of the first, second, or third cattle count of a king. Thus, the act of taxation was tied directly to the passage of time itself. For ordinary Egyptians, the weight of this system was keenly felt. Farmers had to surrender a portion of their harvest, artisans contributed labor or goods, and even herders saw their animals counted and taxed. The system was efficient, but efficiency was not always kindness. Famine or poor floods did not automatically excuse obligations, and officials who enforced taxes could be harsh. Records survive of complaints against corrupt tax collectors, officials accused of seizing more than was due. The bureaucracy was not only a tool of order, but also a source of tension between state and people. Still, the system brought stability. By gathering and redistributing resources, the state could feed large workforces, sustain armies, and support elaborate religious rituals. Workers building temples or pyramids received rations of bread and beer, all calculated from tax grain. Soldiers on campaign were supplied through the same system. Priests, chanting hymns in temples, burned incense purchased with state-managed resources. Without the bureaucracy, Egypt's grandeur would have been impossible. It is striking to consider how much of daily life was shaped by these records. A farmer's year was not only determined by the Nile's floods, but also by the visit of the scribe, who would tally the harvest. A craftsman might spend weeks on state projects, because the tax demanded labor. Even in death, taxes followed tomb inscriptions, sometimes include records of offerings or obligations owed to temples, perpetuating the system into eternity. The Egyptians understood that writing preserved not just memory, but obligation. To be written down was to be bound whether by debt, by tax, or by ritual. The pen, or rather the reed brush, was a tool of power as much as the sword. Pharaohs might claim divine authority, but it was the neat rows of hieratic script on papyrus that ensured the temples were filled, the armies supplied, and the monuments raised. And yet, for all its efficiency, the bureaucracy was vulnerable. Records had to be kept accurately, officials had to remain loyal, and scribes had to resist the temptation of corruption. When the system faltered through drought invasion or internal decay, so too did Egypt's ability to sustain its greatness. The collapse of central authority often left local officials to hoard resources, and without reliable records, redistribution faltered. In this way, the strength of Egypt's empire was tied directly to its bureaucracy's ability to count and to enforce. So we return to the image of scribes with their papyrus rolls, seated in offices near granaries or temples copying lists of grain and cattle. To us, the work may seem tedious, little more than ancient bookkeeping. Yet in those lines of ink lay the power of an empire. The pyramids, the temples, the armies all rested on the scribe's ability to record obligations and the official's ability to enforce them. But this raises a larger question if bureaucracy and tax records sustained Egypt's empire for centuries. What happened when the system grew too heavy, or when the people began to resist its burdens? Section 3. The Weight of Records. The story of Egyptian taxation is not only one of success and endurance, it is also a story of strain. For more than 2,000 years, bureaucracy allowed Egypt to harness the power of the Nile and sustain one of the world's longest-lasting civilizations. Yet even the most efficient system has limits, and the very strength of Egypt's bureaucracy sometimes became its weakness. By the New Kingdom, around 1500 BCE, Egypt had reached its height of power. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses II commanded armies that marched into Syria and Nubia. Gold flowed from Nubian mines, tribute poured in from conquered lands, and monumental temples like Karnak and Abu Simbel rose to the sky. The bureaucracy expanded to meet these demands. Scribes recorded not only domestic taxes, but also foreign tribute. Officials tracked shipments of gold, copper, and exotic goods from afar. The tax machine, once confined to the Nile Valley, now encompassed an empire, but expansion brought complexity. The larger the state, the heavier the burden of administration. More scribes were needed, more officials appointed, more granaries filled. Records multiplied, and so too did opportunities for corruption. Surviving documents from this period contain hints of officials enriching themselves of grain, diverted of taxes levied unfairly. Bureaucracy, once the tool of stability, risked becoming a source of inequality and resentment. The human side of this strain can be seen in one remarkable set of records, the Deir el-Medina texts. Deir el-Medina was a village of workers who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Because these workers were literate, they left behind thousands of ostraca and papyri documenting daily life. Among them are records of ration deliveries, grain, beer, vegetables paid to workers as part of their service to the state. These records show a well-ordered system, but they also reveal its fragility. In times of disruption, when rations were delayed, workers staged strikes, the earliest recorded strikes in history. Even in ancient Egypt, taxation and redistribution could fail, and when they did, ordinary people resisted. As centuries passed, the bureaucracy grew more rigid. During the late period and under foreign rule by Persians, Greeks, and later Romans, taxation became heavier. Records from these times describe a population pressed by demands for grain cattle and labor. Under the Ptolemies, the Greek rulers who followed Alexander the Great taxation reached new levels of detail and burden. Papyri from this era list taxes on everything from land to fishing nets, from cooking oil to poll taxes on individuals. The Egyptian tradition of meticulous record-keeping continued, but the system no longer served a native pharaoh alone. It served foreign rulers extracting wealth. For the peasant farmer, this meant that the annual visit of the scribe could feel less like the rhythm of tradition and more like an unrelenting burden. Fields still had to be measured. Harvests counted, grain surrendered. But the sense of shared obligation that had once sustained monumental building projects gave way to resentment. Taxation, once the engine of Egypt's greatness, became a symbol of decline. The legacy of Egyptian record-keeping, however, cannot be overstated. The thousands of papyri and inscriptions that survive today give us one of the most detailed pictures of ancient administration in the world. Through them, we glimpse not only kings and priests, but also farmers, workers, and local officials. We read lists of names, tallies of goods, and notes of absence. We see a civilization sustained not only by divine authority and monumental stone, but by ink papyrus and the patience of scribes. It is worth pausing to reflect on how unusual this was. Many ancient civilizations left behind myths, poetry, or monumental inscriptions, but Egypt left behind ledgers. Its bureaucracy was not glamorous, but it was durable. And because it was durable, the civilization it supported endured for millennia. Still, the fragility of even the best bureaucracy lingers in the historical record. Famine, corruption, foreign conquest. Each could disrupt the smooth flow of taxes and grain. When records failed, when obligations went uncollected, when officials abused their power, the system weakened. And when the system weakened, the empire itself faltered. Perhaps this is the true lesson of Egypt's tax records, that the foundations of civilization are not only stone pyramids or golden crowns, but lists of obligations, tallies of grain, and careful lines of ink. It was bureaucracy that allowed Egypt to rise, and bureaucracy, strained beyond endurance, that contributed to its decline. So the next time you imagine the pyramids, think also of the scribes seated in shaded offices, tallying grain on papyrus scrolls. Their work was not glorious, but it was essential. Without them, no monument would have risen, no temple would have been filled, no army would have marched. Their records bound an empire together for centuries. And yet one unresolved thought remains. If Egypt's greatness depended so heavily on its ability to count record and tax, what does that tell us about the empires of today built on ledgers and databases? Are we too bound, perhaps, more than we realize, by the quiet weight of records? Story 3, Medieval Laundry. How clothes were cleaned before soap was common. Section 1. Stains, sweat, and the burden of cloth. When you picture the Middle Ages, perhaps you imagine knights in shining armor, noble ladies in embroidered gowns, or peasants working in muddy fields. What you probably do not imagine is laundry. Yet the work of cleaning clothes was one of the most persistent and necessary chores of medieval life. It was also a task that reveals much about the rhythms of survival, the value of textiles, and the long struggle against sweat dirt and the stubborn stains of daily life. The first fact to keep in mind is that clothing in the Middle Ages was not cheap. Textiles were precious. A single wool tunic might take weeks to weave and sew, and linen undergarments, though common, required the cultivation and processing of flax, a labor-intensive crop. For most people, a medieval wardrobe was limited: a few sets of underclothes, a couple of outer garments, perhaps a cloak or hood. Wealthier individuals might own more, but even noble families treated fabric as a valuable possession. Clothing was mended repeatedly, handed down, and sometimes even listed in wills. Because clothing was so valuable, people cared deeply about keeping it clean. Yet, they did not have the tools we take for granted today. Soap, for example, was not commonly available until later in the Middle Ages, and even then, it was expensive. The earliest soaps were made with animal fats and lye, producing a harsh substance better suited for scouring than gentle washing. For most of the period, alternative methods dominated. So how did medieval people wash their clothes? The answer depended on class geography and the type of fabric. But the most common method involved water ash and a great deal of labor. Linen, the favored fabric for undergarments, absorbed sweat and oils from the skin. These garments were boiled or soaked in lye water, a caustic solution made by pouring water through wood ash. Lye helped break down grease and stains, though it was far from gentle on fabric or skin. Woolen garments, on the other hand, could not withstand boiling. They were washed more carefully often, with repeated rinsing and beating in rivers or tubs. This brings us to the laundresses, who were often women working outside the household, especially in towns and cities. They carried baskets of soiled clothes to riversides or communal washhouses. There they scrubbed garments on stones, pounded them with wooden paddles, or trod on them with bare feet. Imagine the scene: rows of women bent over sleeves, rolled up voices carrying over the sound of rushing water and rhythmic pounding. It was grueling work, but also a social activity. Gossip and stories traveled as quickly as the water flowed. The process did not end with washing. Drying clothes posed its own challenges. In summer, garments might be spread on hedges, grass, or wooden frames in the sun. In winter, drying was slower, sometimes requiring garments to be hung indoors near fires, an arrangement that risked scorching or smoke damage. Cleanliness was relative. Clothes often retained faint smells of ash lye or dampness. Freshly washed did not necessarily mean what it does today. The distinction between inner and outer clothing mattered greatly. Outer garments, especially those made of wool, were washed infrequently because the fabric could shrink or lose shape. Instead, they were brushed, beaten to remove dust, or aired outdoors. Linen undergarments were washed more regularly since they touched the skin and absorbed sweat. In this way, hygiene was maintained indirectly. The underclothes protected the outer layers and, keeping them clean, helped preserve both health and appearances. In cities, laundry was sometimes regulated by guilds or overseers. Professional laundresses in medieval Paris, for example, were subject to rules about where they could wash and how they could handle customers' garments. Their work was essential, not just for private households, but also for institutions like monasteries, hospitals, and even armies. A monastery might employ washerwomen to clean the habits of monks. Armies on campaign carried dirty clothing back to camps where laundresses, sometimes traveling with the soldiers, struggled to keep up with the endless demand. Yet, for all the toil, clothing was never spotless by modern standards. Stains from food sweat and the natural dyes of fabric lingered. People accepted this as part of life. To smell strongly of dirt or sweat might be a sign of neglect, but to have garments slightly worn or discolored was simply reality. Cleanliness was a matter of degree, not perfection. There is also the question of water itself. Rivers and streams were the lifeblood of medieval laundry, but they were also polluted by waste from animals, tanneries, and households. Washing clothes in such water was less about hygiene in the modern sense, and more about visible cleanliness and odor control. Clothes might look cleaner after a beating in the river, but whether they were truly sanitary is another question. Textiles themselves were treated differently depending on fiber. Linen, as mentioned, could be boiled. Wool was full of natural oils which repelled some dirt, but trapped others. Silk, rare and precious, was washed sparingly often with delicate rinsing, or dry methods involving powders. In all cases, the aim was preservation as much as cleanliness. A garment that wore out too soon represented not just loss of clothing, but loss of the labor and resources invested in its making. One might imagine that noble households had easier solutions, but even castles and manor houses depended on the same basic methods. Wealth brought access to larger staff and finer materials, but not to radically better cleaning agents. A queen's laundry might smell faintly of lavender if rinsed in scented water, but the fabric was still beaten, soaked, and dried, much like that of a peasant, only handled with more care. As you picture this daily rhythm of washing, boiling, pounding, and drying, consider the unseen weight it carried in medieval life. Laundry was not just about personal hygiene. It was about economy, labor, and survival. Keeping clothes clean meant preserving valuable textiles, preventing disease, and maintaining social respectability. It was labor that touched everyone, from the humblest peasant to the most powerful noble. And yet one question lingers: if medieval people relied so heavily on these crude methods without widespread soap or modern sanitation, how clean were they really by their own standards, and how different was their idea of clean from ours today? Section 2. Washerwomen workhouses and the ritual of cleanliness. When you think of the rhythm of medieval life, you might imagine the ringing of church bells, the cycle of harvest and planting, or the seasonal festivals that punctuated the year. Yet another rhythm, quieter but no less important, was the washing of clothes. Laundry days, whether in a village or a bustling city, required planning, labor, and collective effort. For most medieval households, washing was not a daily chore, but a task performed on specific days, sometimes weekly, sometimes even less often. The responsibility for this work fell largely on women. Within peasant households, wives, daughters, and sometimes servants bore the burden. In towns and cities, professional washerwomen emerged as essential figures, offering services to families, institutions, and travelers. These women were often poor, widowed, or unmarried, and laundry provided them with a source of income. Their work was backbreaking, involving heavy lifting, long hours in cold or damp conditions, and exposure to caustic lye solutions. But it was steady employment, and in an era when few opportunities were available to women outside domestic service, it carried its own form of independence. Professional washerwomen sometimes belonged to loose guild-like associations, particularly in larger cities. Records from Paris and Florence mention laundresses who rented space along rivers or worked in public washhouses. These spaces were hubs of activity, full of the sound of water slapping against fabric and wooden beaters striking clothes. The riverbanks became social spaces too, where gossip and news were exchanged. Laundry, like the marketplace, was a place where information circulated freely. The tools of the trade were simple but effective. The washing beetle, a flat wooden paddle, was used to pound dirt and grease out of fabric. Wooden tubs held soaking garments often steeped in hot lye water. Ash was not the only ingredient in these mixtures. In some regions, fuller's earth, a clay-like substance with absorbent properties, was used to draw oils and stains from cloth. In others, fermented urine was collected as its ammonia content acted as a cleaning agent. For modern sensibilities, this seems shocking, but in the Middle Ages, practicality outweighed squeamishness. Collecting urine was even an organized process in some towns, with chamber pots emptied into designated vats for laundresses and tanners to use. One of the more surprising aspects of medieval laundry is the scale of the work for institutions. Consider a monastery with dozens of monks. Each monk wore a linen habit beneath his woolen robes. The habits absorbed sweat and needed regular washing. The task of cleaning them fell either to lay servants or to women employed specifically for the job. Hospitals, too, required constant laundry for sheets, bandages, and clothing, creating a near-industrial demand for washerwomen. During times of plague, this work was particularly dangerous as soiled fabrics might carry disease. Armies presented another challenge. Soldiers on campaign generated mountains of dirty clothing and linens. Washerwomen, often camp followers, accompanied armies to provide laundry services, along with cooking and other support. These women lived precarious lives, caught between necessity and marginalization. Chronicles mention them rarely, yet without their labor, soldiers would have suffered greatly from filth, lice, and disease. Clean undergarments were as much a defense against illness as weapons were against enemies. The social perception of laundresses was complex. On the one hand, their work was indispensable. On the other, washerwomen were sometimes associated with poverty, rough manners, or even immorality. Their presence on the margins of rivers and in communal washhouses exposed them to scrutiny, and satirical literature occasionally mocked them as bawdy or unruly. Yet their labor touched every class of society, from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest noble. Even kings depended on the quiet, unseen toil of washerwomen to maintain the fabric of daily life, literally. For wealthier households, the management of laundry became a matter of organization and status. A noble household might employ dedicated laundresses who worked within the estate, boiling linens in large cauldrons, drying them on racks and folding them carefully. Inventories from great households list not only garments, but also washing equipment tubs, wooden paddles, and linen presses. Clean, well-kept clothing was a visible sign of order and refinement. A nobleman appearing in rumpled or stained garments risked whispers about his household's management. Thus, laundry connected to reputation as much as hygiene. Seasonal rhythms also shaped laundry practices. In summer, washing could be done outdoors with garments drying quickly in the sun. In winter, however, laundry became a trial. Frozen rivers made washing difficult, and drying clothes in damp, cold weather was slow. Garments hung near fires risked smoke damage or even accidental burning. Some households delayed major laundry until spring, relying on spare garments to carry them through the colder months. This seasonal cycle underscores how clothing was managed with care and foresight, not washed casually, as in modern times. The act of bleaching provides another fascinating detail. To restore whiteness to linen clothes were sometimes spread on grassy meadows, dampened, and left under the sun for days or weeks. The ultraviolet light helped whiten the fibers, though the process was slow and weather-dependent. In some regions, entire fields were dedicated to this purpose, creating landscapes dotted with pale garments fluttering in the wind. Such sights must have been strangely beautiful. A meadow transformed into a tapestry of drying linen, symbolizing both cleanliness and labor. If we step back, what emerges is a picture of laundry, not as a mundane side task, but as a central element of medieval survival. The materials, methods, and organization required reveal a world where cleanliness was hard-won. For us, a washing machine hums quietly in the background. For them, laundry was an all-day effort involving family, community, and sometimes entire institutions. The very act of wearing clean linen marked you as respectable and well-managed, while filth hinted at disorder, poverty, or neglect. And yet, one might ask, how did the constant toil of laundry shape social bonds, identities, and even gender roles in medieval society? Was this work merely drudgery, or did it carry hidden forms of power, belonging, and meaning for those who bent over the tubs and rivers day after day? Section 3: Cleanliness, Purity, and the Weight of the Ordinary. If you close your eyes and imagine a medieval town, you might picture stone churches, timber-framed houses, narrow streets, and market stalls overflowing with goods. Less visible, but no less essential, were the constant rhythms of maintenance, the grinding of grain, the tending of fires, and the washing of clothes. Of these, laundry may seem the least significant, but in truth, it intersected with some of the most important concerns of medieval life, health, religion, and the very idea of social order. To begin with, health laundry played a subtle but vital role in combating disease. In an age without modern medicine, where epidemics like the Black Death swept across Europe, people grasped for any measures that seemed to preserve well-being. Clean linen, more than clean skin, became a marker of hygiene. Physicians of the medieval period often emphasized that wearing freshly washed linen garments helped wick sweat and impurities away from the body. The skin itself was believed to breathe, and if dirt or sweat clogged the pores, illness could result. Thus, laundering clothes was not a matter of superficial appearance alone, but tied to theories of bodily health. Hospitals and monasteries, as we have seen, generated mountains of laundry. But they also treated laundry as a line of defense against contagion. Sheets and bandages were boiled in cauldrons, rinsed and dried in the open air. While the medical understanding was rudimentary, the process itself often did reduce bacterial presence, though no one would have known the microscopic reasons why. In towns, washerwomen might be called upon to scrub the clothes of plague victims, or lepers, exposing themselves to danger. Their invisible labor underpinned the fragile defenses of medieval communities against disease. Religion added another dimension. Christianity, the dominant cultural force in medieval Europe, infused ordinary acts with spiritual significance. Clean linen garments, particularly those worn beneath outer layers, symbolized purity and humility. Clergy often wore simple white linen albs beneath their ornate vestments, a reminder of moral cleanliness. Monks washed their habits with regularity, not out of vanity, but out of devotion to order and discipline. Some monastic rules even specified the days on which laundry should be done, reinforcing the idea that cleanliness was a form of spiritual practice. Rituals of baptism and burial also drew on the symbolism of linen. Infants were wrapped in white linen cloth after baptism, a sign of new purity, while the dead were shrouded in clean linen before burial. In both cases, the fabric represented a transition into life and into death. Behind each of these ceremonies was the quiet, unending labor of those who kept the cloths clean, bleached, and ready. The symbolism extended further into the secular realm. To appear in dirty or disordered clothing was not just a sign of personal neglect, it could be read as a moral failing. Medieval moralists, sometimes equated physical filth with sin, while cleanliness suggested virtue. In this way, the laundering of clothes became a subtle but powerful marker of social respectability. A well-managed household demonstrated not only economic stability, but also moral order, visible in the whiteness of its linen. Yet cleanliness was never absolute. The limitations of medieval laundry meant that garments were rarely spotless by modern standards. Dirt accumulated quickly, and fabrics wore out with harsh washing methods. People lived with a level of grime that today might seem unbearable. But what mattered was the effort, the attempt to maintain order against the constant encroachment of filth. Laundry, like prayer, was never finished. It was a cycle to be repeated week after week, year after year. This cycle bound people together. In villages, women gathered by the river to wash, sharing news songs and grievances. In cities, public washhouses echoed with laughter, quarrels, and the slap of paddles against wet cloth. Washerwomen in army camps forged communities of survival, providing each other with support in precarious conditions. Laundry was both isolation hours of repetitive toil and community, a shared experience that wove together the fabric of daily life as surely as the garments themselves did. At the same time, laundry revealed inequalities. Wealthy households could afford dedicated laundresses, better equipment, and higher quality fabrics that withstood repeated washings. Poor families had fewer garments worn threadbare and patched again and again, their laundry a constant struggle against scarcity. Washerwomen themselves often lived on the edge of poverty, dependent on demanding and sometimes demeaning work. The clean linen of the wealthy was built upon the aching backs of the poor. Still, for all its burdens, laundry shaped medieval culture in quiet but enduring ways. The methods developed for scouring, bleaching, and pressing fabric laid the foundation for later textile industries. The communal spaces of laundry foreshadowed public utilities and labor collectives. Even the simple act of spreading white linen on grass to bleach in the sun carried an aesthetic that survives in our language. The very word launder comes from the Latin lavare, to wash, and echoes of that effort remain in our modern notions of clean slates and fresh starts. So when we picture the Middle Ages, it is worth pausing to remember not only the castles, the battles, or the soaring cathedrals, but also the sight of riverbanks lined with women beating cloth against stones, the smell of wood ash and wet fabric, and the flutter of drying linen in a meadow. These ordinary details sustained the extraordinary structures of medieval life. Without clean clothes, there could be no respectable court, no disciplined monastery, no functioning hospital, and no healthy army. And so we return to the paradox. Laundry was mundane, repetitive, even boring. But it was also essential, symbolic, and deeply human. In the end, perhaps the question is not how medieval people endured the endless labor of washing clothes, but how that labor, in its quiet persistence, shaped the very texture of their world. Story 4. The Salt Roads. A Forgotten Economy of Preservation. Section 1. Why Salt Mattered More Than Gold. When you think of valuable commodities in the ancient and medieval world, your mind may drift to gold, silver, or fine textiles like silk. But long before spices from Asia or sugar from the New World transformed European tastes, there was another substance that determined survival: salt. Ordinary granular white crystals, the kind you might not notice scattered across a kitchen table, were once the foundation of entire economies. Salt mattered because it preserved life in more ways than one. First, and most obviously, humans require sodium to survive. Unlike some minerals, the body cannot generate salt on its own. A deficiency leads to weakness, confusion, and eventually death. Ancient people living without the benefit of processed foods that today hide salt in every corner of our diet needed regular and reliable access to it. For inland communities far from the coast, acquiring enough salt was a challenge that shaped trade, politics, and culture. More crucial still, salt preserved food. In an age without refrigeration, salting meat, fish, or even certain vegetables was the only way to store calories for the long winters or to transport provisions over long distances. Salted herring, for example, became a staple in medieval northern Europe, feeding towns and armies alike. Without salt, armies could not march, sailors could not cross seas, and cities could not survive in lean years. In many respects, salt was the hidden infrastructure of civilization. This necessity transformed salt into something far greater than a seasoning. It became a currency, a political tool, and the reason for entire networks of trade routes, roads, sometimes stretching hundreds of miles carrying caravans of pack animals, loaded with sacks of crystals or barrels of brine, evaporated into solid form. These were the salt roads' arteries of survival, where the most ordinary of minerals moved through landscapes with the weight of gold. Take, for instance, the Via Salaria in Italy. Its very name, the Salt Road Venere, testifies to its origins. Long before Rome became an empire, the Sabines, an Italic people of central Italy, used this route to carry salt from the Adriatic coast inland. The Romans inherited and expanded the road, ensuring that salt could be transported into the city itself. Roman legions marching out to conquer new territories may have been fueled by wheat and wine, but behind the glory was the quiet utility of salt. Without preserved food, those legions would never have been sustained. Beyond Rome, other salt roads crisscrossed Europe. The French had the routes du sel, where salt harvested from coastal marshes was carried inland. In Germany, the Alte Salzstrasse, Old Salt Road, connected the salt-rich town of Lüneburg with Lübeck on the Baltic Sea, allowing salt to be shipped across northern Europe. In Africa, salt caravans wound across the Sahara, with camel trains bringing slabs of salt to kingdoms like Mali, where salt was sometimes traded for gold in nearly equal measure. Everywhere, salt dictated the flow of trade and the shaping of routes. But salt was not merely a matter of economy and sustenance. It was also a matter of power. Rulers and states quickly realized that controlling salt production and trade meant controlling people's lives. Ancient Chinese dynasties levied salt taxes as early as the first millennium BCE, using the revenue to fund armies and bureaucracies. In medieval France, the infamous gabelle, or salt tax, became one of the most hated and enduring burdens on the peasantry. It was not simply about money, it was about survival. If you taxed salt, you taxed the ability of ordinary people to preserve food, to feed their families, and to endure the winter. This is why, despite its ordinariness, salt was wrapped in social tension. To eat without salt was impossible, yet to acquire. It often meant enduring political oppression. Smuggling salt became common across Europe, with entire underground economies built on avoiding the reach of tax collectors. Salt thus existed in a paradoxical state. It was essential, humble, and universal, yet it carried with it layers of inequality and power. The physical nature of salt itself shaped how it was traded. Unlike gold, which could be melted and minted, or spices, which could be carried in small pouches, salt was bulky. It was transported in heavy sacks, crates, or large slabs. Moving salt across long distances required specialized pack animals, ships and roads strong enough to bear the weight. The roads themselves were transformed by this commerce, and many of them would later evolve into the trade routes, highways, and infrastructure of Europe and beyond. What began as the steady trudge of salt-laden donkeys became centuries later the movement of armies and merchants across the same paths. For ordinary people, salt remained intimately connected with daily survival. In the kitchen, salt preserved pork and fish, two of the most important sources of protein in pre-industrial Europe. In the workshop, salt was used in tanning hides, dyeing fabrics, and even in certain metallurgical processes. In the religious sphere, salt carried symbolic weight. In Christianity, it was a symbol of purity and incorruptibility. In Judaism, a covenant was sealed with salt. In Japan, sumo wrestlers scattered salt to purify the ring. What began as necessity became layered with meaning, until salt was not only the substance of survival, but also the substance of ritual. And yet, behind all these grand meanings, the actual work of salt remained grindingly practical. Workers in salt pans bent over brine, scraping crystals as the sun dried shallow pools. Miners chipped away at deep underground deposits in places like Hallstatt in Austria, where salt mining goes back to prehistoric times. Camel drivers in the Sahara endured endless marches to carry slabs of salt across dunes. Peasants shouldered the burden of carrying salt inland, step by step, sack by sack. For them, salt was no symbol. It was heavy, exhausting, and sometimes deadly work. If you pause and think of it, salt is one of the strangest commodities in history. On the one hand, it is utterly ordinary, abundant, cheap, even overlooked today. On the other, it was once as valuable as silver, capable of sparking wars, shaping taxes, and building empires. Salt's power lay not in its rarity, but in its necessity. Unlike gold or silk, which only the wealthy truly required, salt was universal. Rich and poor alike needed it. That universality made salt both precious and politically explosive. So, as you imagine, the world of the salt roads, think not of glittering markets filled with exotic luxuries, but of heavy wagons creaking along rutted tracks, their loads destined not for kings alone, but for every table in every household. Salt was the quiet heartbeat of survival, the mineral that bound together empires, peasants, armies, and merchants. But this leaves us with a question: if salt was so essential, how exactly were these salt roads maintained, and what did the daily grind of transporting salt across great distances look like? Section 2. The Long March of Salt. If salt was the quiet heartbeat of survival, then the roads it traveled were the veins and arteries that kept civilizations alive. Unlike precious metals or fine silks, salt was never light or elegant. It was heavy, unwieldy, and abundant only in certain regions. Moving it from those sources to the mouths of distant consumers required an enormous logistical effort. This meant that salt, more than most other commodities, shaped the geography of trade itself. To begin with, we must understand the nature of salt in its raw form. Some salt was gathered from the sea through evaporation ponds and marshes, where tides left shallow pools to dry in the sun. This method was common in warm coastal regions, such as southern France, the Mediterranean, and West Africa. Other salt came from underground deposits mined from places where ancient seas had dried up, leaving behind veins of crystallized minerals. The mines of Hallstatt in Austria, Wieliczka in Poland, and Salzburg, literally salt fortress, became renowned for their productivity. The salt mined in such places was not light nor easily portable. Great blocks of mineral salt had to be hauled out of the earth, cut into slabs, or broken into chunks. From there, the long journey began. Pack animals, donkeys, oxen, camels were loaded with as much as they could carry. In Europe, horses were used where the terrain allowed, though donkeys and mules often proved more reliable on narrow, mountainous paths. In the Sahara, Long camel caravans became iconic. A single camel could carry up to 300 pounds of salt, trudging across blistering dunes for weeks at a time. These caravans moved slowly with the steady plodding of beasts of burden, setting the rhythm of the road. Roads themselves were rarely smooth. Salt routes cut through forests, hills, marshes, and deserts. The famous Via Salaria in Italy, maintained under Roman engineering, offered a rare example of a well-built highway. Elsewhere, routes were little more than rutted tracks, their surfaces hardened by the repeated weight of hooves and wheels. In wet seasons, the roads became mud traps. In dry seasons, choking dust followed every step. Salt's bulk meant it needed space. Wagons were common, but they added complications. A wagon pulled by oxen or horses carried a greater load, yet it required better road conditions. A broken axle, a bogged-down wheel, or a collapsed bridge could halt an entire convoy. Thus, pack trains, strings of animals carrying smaller loads, remained essential for traversing rough terrain. In mountainous areas particularly, the Alps salt transport became an art of balance, with men and animals edging carefully along narrow paths, a single misstep enough to scatter a precious load into the abyss. Moving salt was not only a matter of endurance, it was also a matter of regulation. States and lords recognized the opportunity to profit from the burdened caravans that crossed their lands. Toll stations appeared at river crossings, mountain passes, and city gates. Every sack of salt that passed through was measured, weighed, and taxed. In some regions, special salt tariffs were created separate from other goods. Rulers treated salt not as an ordinary commodity, but as a vital one, and therefore a lucrative one. Consider France's gabella. Though more famous for its hated tax at the point of sale, the system was part of a larger network of regulation that stretched back along the roads themselves. Caravans were often escorted, inspected, and monitored. Smugglers tried to slip salt across borders without paying the tax, creating what were known as faux sauniers, illegal salt traders. Whole regions of the French countryside saw shadow economies emerge with smugglers hiding salt in barrels of grain or sacks of wool. Soldiers and tax collectors hunted them relentlessly, and punishment was severe. But the smuggling continued because where salt moved, life moved with it. The story was similar in China, where the imperial state claimed monopoly control of salt production and distribution. Roads and canals designed for salt transport became arteries of imperial power. Salt caravans moving in regulated convoys kept the bureaucracy flush with revenue. Entire stretches of road were maintained specifically to accommodate the salt trade with rest stations, warehouses, and guard posts. Here, the salt road was not just a path of trade, but an extension of state control. For those who worked the roads, life was monotonous and grueling. Teamsters walked alongside their animals for miles each day, enduring blisters, weather, and exhaustion. Inns and way stations provided occasional rest, but much of the time was spent outdoors sleeping by campfires, guarding loads against thieves or wolves. The salt itself, packed in sacks or barrels, was heavy and rough. It absorbed moisture, so rain was an enemy, forcing traders to keep loads dry with tarpaulins or careful packing. Spilled salt was not just a loss of profit, it was a loss of survival for the communities waiting at the journey's end. Interestingly, the smell of a salt road was distinctive. In coastal regions, where briny marsh salt was packed into carts, the faint tang of the sea followed the caravans inland. In desert caravans, slabs of crystalline rock salt carried the sharp, mineral scent of the earth. Mixed with the sweat of animals and men, the smoke of campfires, and the dust of the road, the journey of salt was as much an assault on the senses as it was a test of endurance. These journeys also created cultural connections. Along the salt roads, inns and market towns sprang up, serving not just traders, but anyone passing through. A village might prosper simply by existing along a salt route, its economy tied to the steady rhythm of passing caravans. Merchants, peasants, soldiers, and pilgrims mingled along these roads, exchanging not just salt, but also news customs and ideas. The Salt Road was thus a cultural artery, as well as an economic one. Yet, for all its importance, the Salt Road was fragile. A flood could wash out a bridge, cutting off a region from its supply. A war could seize control of a road, turning salt into a weapon of siege. In medieval warfare, besieging armies often sought to choke salt routes, starving cities of their ability to preserve food. The control of salt roads became a quiet but decisive factor in military strategy. Whoever held the roads held the means of survival. Still, the most remarkable thing about the salt roads was their persistence. Long after salt lost its political weight, many of these roads remained in use. The Alte Salzstrasse in Germany became a major trade route connecting the Baltic and interior Europe, long after Lüneburg salt had lost its monopoly. The Via Salaria remained a vital artery for centuries, shaping the geography of central Italy. Even in Africa, the routes carved by camel caravans centuries ago still echo in modern trade paths. Salt bulky and humble, left behind roads that would serve as the skeleton of transportation for generations. As we picture the slow march of salt caravans across dusty landscapes weighed down by barrels and slabs, we must ask, what was the larger consequence of this grinding movement of minerals? Beyond survival and taxation, what did the salt roads do to shape entire societies, their economies, and even their patterns of settlement? Section 3. Salt roads and the shaping of civilizations. By the time a caravan of salt arrived at its destination, its journey had already shaped countless lives. The heavy blocks carried on donkeys, oxen, or camels were more than simple minerals. They were threads binding villages to towns, towns to cities, and cities to empires. To trace the path of salt roads is to uncover how an ordinary commodity became the quiet scaffolding of civilization. Salt roads did not just move salt, they moved power. Whoever controlled them wielded influence far beyond the dusty trail. Rulers quickly understood this. Roman magistrates who supervised the Via Salaria ensured not only that salt reached the capital, but also that Rome's legions had preserved food on campaign. In China, dynasties from the Han through the Qing made the salt monopoly one of their most enduring institutions. The bureaucracy of salt taxes filled imperial treasuries, paying for armies, canals, and palaces. In Europe, the Holy Roman Empire, France, and Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa all wrestled with salt routes. Venice, in particular, built much of its wealth on controlling the flow of salt through the Adriatic and Mediterranean. The city's fleets did not just carry spices or silks, but barrels of salt, heavy, humble cargo that underpinned the luxury trade. To Venice, salt was the foundation upon which more glamorous commerce was built. Beyond rulers and merchants, whole communities were shaped by their place along a salt road. A village that served as a staging point for caravans might grow into a bustling town, its economy sustained by inns, blacksmiths, and markets serving traders. Towns like Lüneburg in northern Germany thrived for centuries thanks to their salt works and the Alte Salzstrasse that carried its crystals to Lübeck and the Baltic ports. The wealth from this one commodity helped fund the rise of the Hanseatic League, the powerful confederation of trading cities that dominated northern Europe in the late Middle Ages. In West Africa, Salt roads played an equally decisive role. Caravans of camels carried salt slabs from the Sahara to trade for gold, ivory, and slaves in the Sahel and beyond. This exchange linked desert mining towns like Tagaza with mighty empires such as Mali. The balance of wealth between gold-rich kingdoms and salt-rich deserts created a unique dynamic. Salt was as precious as gold, not for adornment but for life itself. It was salt that allowed cities like Timbuktu to thrive as crossroads of trade and scholarship. Religious and cultural practices were also influenced by salt roads. Salt became embedded in rituals used to purify, to seal agreements, and to protect against evil. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites often used the same roads as salt traders, finding along the way inns and markets built to serve caravans. Salt thus traveled not only into kitchens, but into prayers and ceremonies, its humble presence woven into spiritual life. Yet the power of salt roads came at a cost. Tolls, monopolies, and taxes made salt a frequent source of resentment. In France, the gabelle became one of the most despised taxes in history, contributing to the anger that erupted in the French Revolution. Smuggling networks, or fauconniers, became a way of life for many peasants. Their quiet defiance a reminder of how something as small as a pinch of salt could fuel political unrest. In China, corruption in the salt bureaucracy often weakened dynasties, draining legitimacy, as ordinary people bore the burden of inflated prices. Despite the frustrations, salt roads endured for centuries because no society could do without them. They were the lifeline of preservation in a pre-refrigeration world. Meat, fish, butter, cheese all required salt to be stored through winter's famines or journeys. Armies marched with salted rations. Navies sailed with barrels of brined food. Salt was survival, and survival depended on the roads. But like all foundations of human life, the salt roads were not eternal. The invention of modern preservation, first canning in the 19th century, then refrigeration and freezing in the 20th, diminished salt's centrality. Though still valued, it no longer held the monopoly over survival it once did. The heavy caravans dwindled, the toll stations lost relevance, and towns that had thrived on salt trade found themselves bypassed by railroads and highways. The salt roads faded into memory, their once busy tracks now quiet country lanes or archaeological curiosities. Yet their legacy remains. Modern borders towns and trade patterns often follow the paths first carved by salt traders. The Via Salaria still exists as a road in Italy, its name a fossil reminder of its ancient purpose. In Germany, the Alte Salzstrasse has become a scenic tourist route, with plaques explaining its role in medieval commerce. Even in Africa, echoes of the great camel caravans remain in cultural memory, their stories passed down as part of a proud history of endurance. Looking back, salt roads remind us that civilization is not built solely on dramatic battles, monumental architecture, or glittering treasures. It is built on the everyday necessities, on heavy sacks, carried by tired animals and weary men, on tolls collected at dusty checkpoints, on the patient plodding of caravans that connected remote communities into vast networks. They show us how something ordinary, even boring, could be the quiet architect of empires. And so, as we trace these forgotten roads across mountains, rivers, and deserts, we return to the essential question: if the unglamorous trade of salt could shape the rise and fall of kingdoms, what other hidden commodities lost in the background of history quietly steered the course of human destiny? Story 5. The Calendar Reform Nobody Noticed. Adjusting Time in the Middle Ages. Section 1. The Slow Drift of Time. When you wake up today and glance at a calendar on your wall, there is a quiet assurance behind the numbers you see. The 1st of January will arrive with winter's chill. The 21st of March will bring the equinox, and December 25th will, as always, fall in the depths of winter. But in the Middle Ages, such certainty was not guaranteed. For centuries, Europe lived with a calendar that slowly slipped away from the seasons, its errors measured not in seconds or minutes, but in creeping days that accumulated across generations. The culprit was the Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BCE. Caesar, with the help of Alexandrian astronomers, had imposed order on the Roman year, declaring that a solar year should be counted as 365 days, with an extra leap day every 4th year, to make up for the fractional remainder. It was a bold attempt to align human reckoning with the heavens. For a time it worked. Festivals returned to their proper seasons, farmers knew roughly when to plant, and priests could keep their rituals aligned with celestial events. But the Julian year was not perfect. The actual solar year, the time it takes the Earth to orbit the Sun, is not 365.25 days. It is slightly shorter, around 365 to 422 days. That tiny discrepancy of 11 minutes a year was invisible to the ordinary person. Yet, like a grain of sand dropped steadily into a jar, it accumulated. Over centuries, those minutes piled into days. By the early Middle Ages, the calendar had slipped far enough that the spring equinox, once fixed on March 21st, was occurring several days earlier in the actual sky. The average peasant, of course, would never have noticed. Time for them was measured not in abstract dates, but in cycles of work and worship, the ringing of church bells, the passing of seasons, the rhythm of planting harvest and holy days. But for the Church, which governed not only prayer, but also the great festival of Easter, the drift was increasingly problematic. Easter was tied to the spring equinox, calculated through intricate tables of lunar cycles. If the equinox in the sky no longer matched the equinox in the calendar, then the celebration risked falling out of step with the heavens. This slow calendar drift was not in itself a crisis. It was more like a creeping dissonance, a gentle slide that most people ignored. Yet in monasteries where timekeeping was an act of devotion, the errors became noticeable. Monks who carefully tracked equinoxes, solstices, and the rising of stars recorded their observations on parchment. Astronomers noted that celestial events were no longer matching the calendar dates handed down from Rome. Over time, scholars and clerics began to murmur about the need for reform, though their voices rarely carried beyond the cloister. Meanwhile, the medieval world went about its business. Markets opened on feast days, marked in the Julian calendar. Royal charters dated themselves to months that no longer quite corresponded to the seasons. Pilgrims journeyed to shrines on anniversaries that were drifting out of alignment with the natural year. And yet, because everyone lived within the same system, few people found reason to object. The discrepancy did not cause crops to fail or bells to toll out of turn. Time, even when imperfectly measured, still flowed. This subtle drift reveals something essential about medieval life, the way ordinary people lived with and often ignored the abstractions imposed by authority. The calendar was for most a matter of the church and the crown. Days were named, months were counted, but the reality of daily survival was tied less to dates than to weather, daylight, and communal routine. If the equinox came on the 16th of March, rather than the 21st, who beyond a scholar, in a scriptorium, would have reason to care? And yet over the centuries, this imperceptible slippage began to matter more. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the equinox was arriving almost 10 days earlier than the calendar proclaimed. This created growing unease among churchmen tasked with keeping holy days in harmony with Scripture and the heavens. Councils discussed the problem. Scholars debated possible corrections. A few even suggested ways to realign the year. But reform was easier spoken of than enacted. The calendar was not just a scientific tool. It was a sacred framework embedded in rituals, legal contracts, and the rhythm of medieval life. To change it meant asking the entire Christian world to adjust its reckoning of time. For centuries, then, reform remained a whisper rather than an action. Monks noted the drift in their chronicles. Astronomers recalculated tables for Easter. Councils acknowledged the problem, but deferred the solution. The medieval world lived on with a flawed calendar, its days slipping gently out of step with the stars, while life continued as if nothing were amiss. It is this quiet paradox, a system known to be faulty, yet left untouched, that gives the calendar drift of the Middle Ages its peculiar fascination. Unlike a war or a famine, this was a slow problem, barely noticed by the masses, yet gnawing steadily at the intellectual foundations of Christendom. For the Church, whose claim to authority included mastery of sacred time, the error was a thorn. For rulers, the issue was less urgent, overshadowed by taxes, wars, and dynastic struggles. And for the people, it was invisible, their days guided more by the sun in the sky than the numbers on a parchment. The question then lingers, how long could medieval society continue to live with a calendar it knew to be wrong? Would the whispers of reform remain tucked in the margins of manuscripts? Or would they one day demand the attention of kings and popes alike? Section 2 counsels scholars and the weight of tradition. By the 12th century, the drift of the Julian calendar was no longer a subtle footnote. To anyone attentive to the heavens, it was unmistakable. The spring equinox, which church tradition insisted fell on March 21st, was being observed by the sun on March 13th or 14th. For monks responsible for calculating Easter, the great feast of the Christian year, this was not just an inconvenience. It was a growing contradiction between liturgy and the cosmos. And yet nothing was done. To understand why, you must imagine how intertwined the calendar was with the medieval world. Dates were not mere markers of time. They underpinned feasts, fasts, contracts, charters, and even the obligations of kings. The authority of the Church rested in part on its ability to anchor sacred time. To admit that the system itself was drifting was to acknowledge a flaw in one of the most fundamental frameworks of Christendom. Reform, though increasingly discussed, was politically and spiritually risky. Still, voices of concern grew louder. The universities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford all produced scholars who grappled with the problem. Astronomers, often working within the Church, recalculated lunar cycles and produced tables, attempting to correct for the drift. Some of the greatest minds of the Middle Ages left traces of their worries in marginal notes and scholastic debates. Robert Grosseteste, the 13th century Bishop of Lincoln, noted with precision the discrepancy between the calendar year and the observed heavens. Roger Bacon, his contemporary, pressed even harder. He warned that the growing misalignment threatened the integrity of Easter's dating and called for an immediate reform of the calendar. Bacon's plea, made to Pope Clement IV in the 1260s, was among the first forceful demands for action. In his Opus Maius, he outlined how the Julian system had slipped and proposed adjustments. But Clement died before acting, and Bacon's words, like so many, faded into the vast storehouse of medieval scholarly worries. The issue surfaced again in the councils of the Church. The most notable was the Council of Vienne in 1311 to 1312. Among its many items of business, including Suppressing the Knights Templar, the council briefly discussed the question of the calendar. Scholars had made the problem clear. The equinox was no longer falling on the expected date. But amid the political storms of Christendom, with popes exiled to Avignon and kings challenging papal authority, reforming the reckoning of time did not rise to the top of the agenda. One reason for this hesitation was practical. Reforming the calendar would have meant discarding centuries of established feast days. Every charter, every legal record, every anniversary inscribed in parchment was tied to the Julian reckoning. A correction would mean that saints' days, carefully aligned over centuries, might need to shift. Pilgrimages, fairs, and contracts based on fixed feast days would be thrown into confusion. In an age when legal and sacred authority leaned heavily on continuity, such disruption was daunting. There was also a deeper hesitation. The calendar had been instituted by Julius Caesar and sanctified by centuries of Christian use. To alter it felt in some minds like tampering with divine order itself. If God permitted the drift, was it not presumptuous for humans to attempt to fix time? Even those who recognized the growing problem often couched their proposals cautiously, deferring to papal judgment and divine will. Meanwhile, the practical workarounds continued. Scholars produced updated Computus tables, the elaborate numerical guides used to calculate Easter. These tables attempted to patch over the discrepancy by predicting lunar cycles more carefully. Each generation of scholars knew that the base calendar was wrong, but they worked around it by recalculating Easter for the next few decades, essentially buying time. In monasteries, scribes carefully copied these tables into manuscripts, ensuring that Easter would be celebrated consistently, even if not entirely in harmony with the heavens. Occasionally, reforms seemed within reach. Pope Sixtus IV, in the 15th century, better remembered for commissioning the Sistine Chapel, received petitions about the calendar. The issue was raised again at the Council of Basel in the 15th century, though no action was taken. It was discussed at the Fifth Lateran Council in the early 16th century, once more acknowledged, once more postponed. Through all this, life in Europe went on. A peasant in 1400 knew nothing of equinox drift. His or her world was bounded by sunrise and sunset by church bells summoning to mass by the rhythms of field and village. Easter was celebrated when the church declared it regardless of whether the moon and stars agreed. Markets and fairs were held on dates listed in charters. To most people, the wrongness of the calendar had no practical consequence. But to scholars, the unease deepened. The growing spread of knowledge, the translation of Arabic astronomical texts, the revival of classical learning meant that more educated Europeans could see the flaws in their inherited system. In Spain, Islamic scholars had already refined calendar calculations more precisely. In Italy, humanists were rediscovering ancient texts that emphasized harmony between human reckoning and the cosmos. The contrast between what was known and what was practiced sharpened the sense that Christendom was out of step with the universe itself. And yet, even as the Renaissance dawned, Europe clung to the Julian calendar. The Middle Ages, with their devotion to tradition and their caution in altering sacred structures, bequeathed to the modern world both the awareness of the problem and the reluctance to solve it. Reform was possible, even proposed, but never enacted. This long hesitation leaves us with a question that historians continue to ponder. Why did Europe allow its calendar to drift for nearly 1,000 years when the problem was widely known by its own intellectuals? Was it fear of disrupting sacred rhythms? Or was it the weight of inertia, the simple difficulty of persuading the entire continent to agree on the reordering of time itself? Section 3. the Gregorian solution, and the quiet shift of time. By the 16th century, the slow drift of the Julian calendar was impossible to ignore. Scholars, monks, and astronomers had been warning for centuries that the calendar no longer matched the heavens. By 1500, the spring equinox fell around March 11th, 10 days earlier than the Church's traditional reckoning of March 21st. The implications for Easter, the cornerstone of the Christian liturgical year, had become too pressing to dismiss. The momentum for reform coincided with the broader spirit of the Renaissance. Europe was looking outward across oceans and into the skies. The voyages of discovery required precise navigation, which depended on reliable astronomical charts. The Protestant Reformation had shattered Christian unity, making liturgical consistency a matter of renewed urgency. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church, preparing for the Council of Trent, recognized that calendar reform could serve as a demonstration of intellectual and spiritual authority. The decisive figure was Pope Gregory XIII. Elected in 1572, Gregory inherited centuries of unresolved debate. Unlike his predecessors, he was determined to act. To do so, he convened a commission of scholars and astronomers, including the Jesuit mathematician Christopher Clavius, a man whose rigorous mind would guide the technical details of reform. The challenge was clear: how to realign the calendar with the solar year without destroying the rhythms of daily life. The Julian calendar was drifting by about 3 days every 4 centuries. To fix this, the Commission proposed 2 measures. First, 10 days would be dropped from the calendar, immediately bringing the equinox back to its rightful date. Second, the rules governing leap years would be adjusted. Instead of adding a leap day every 4 years without exception, century years like 1600, 1700, etc., would only include a leap day if divisible by 400. This subtle but critical change reduced the average calendar year to 365.2425 days, far closer to the solar year than Caesar's Julian system. In 1582, Pope Gregory issued the papal bull Inter Gravissimus, announcing the reform. The bull declared that Thursday, October 4th, 1582, would be followed not by Friday, October 5th, but by Friday, October 15th. 10 days vanished from the lives of millions. People went to bed one evening and awoke 10 days closer to winter. For the modern imagination, the loss of 10 days seems dramatic. Yet, in much of Catholic Europe, the reform passed with surprising calm. The rhythms of ordinary life, rising at dawn, sowing fields, attending Mass, were largely unaffected. The great annual feasts still arrived in their familiar order, even if shifted slightly against the stars. Contracts and rents were adjusted. Feast days were observed on their new dates without much fuss. Not everyone welcomed the change. In Protestant lands, suspicion was immediate. To many Protestants, the papal bull was an unwelcome intrusion, a Catholic imposition on their reckoning of time. Some feared trickery, that by losing days, landlords might demand a full month's rent for fewer days' occupancy, or that wages might be shorted. England and its colonies clung to the Julian calendar until 1752, nearly 2 centuries later, when the discrepancy had grown to 11 days. Russia held out even longer, not adopting the Gregorian system until after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918. In Catholic realms, however, the adjustment was swift. Spain, Portugal, and most of Italy adopted it immediately. France followed within weeks. The Holy Roman Empire and Poland soon joined. Within a few decades, much of Europe had quietly accepted a new measure of time. The reform had implications beyond liturgy. Navigation benefited, as sailors relied on more accurate tables for calculating longitude. Astronomical observations, increasingly refined by instruments like Tycho Brahe's quadrants, now aligned more closely with the official calendar. Historians and record-keepers face the challenge of reconciling documents dated in different systems, a problem that lingers in the historical record today, where dates must often be marked Old-style Julian or New-style Gregorian. For ordinary people, however, the change passed largely unnoticed. A farmer in Castile or a fisherman in Naples continued to labor under the same sun and moon. If his priest told him that the feast of St. Michael would now be observed on a slightly different date, he accepted it. The calendar reform, for all its intellectual boldness, blended into the continuity of daily toil. And yet, beneath that surface calm, something profound had happened. For the first time in more than a millennium, Europe had reshaped the very structure of time. The Gregorian reform was not simply a clerical correction. It was a demonstration of how human institutions could reorder the rhythms of the world. It signaled a shift toward a more scientific age, when observation and calculation could guide decisions as fundamental as how the year itself was measured. The legacy of Gregory's calendar endures. Today, the Gregorian calendar is the most widely used system of timekeeping in the world. Its leap year adjustments keep our clocks aligned with the sun with remarkable precision, drifting only by about 1 day every 3,000 years. Still, the centuries of hesitation that preceded it remain instructive. The Middle Ages knew the problem, debated it, even proposed solutions, yet change did not come until a pope in the Renaissance finally commanded it. This long delay reminds us that history is often shaped not by knowledge alone, but by the willingness to act upon it. And so we are left with a quiet paradox. The most radical adjustment to time in European history was for most people barely noticed. Days were lost, centuries of reckoning were altered, and yet life went on, marked by bells and harvests, saints and seasons. It invites a final question. If something as fundamental as the measurement of time itself could be altered with so little disruption, how many other hidden structures in our lives, economic, political, or cultural, might shift beneath us without our noticing? Until centuries later, Story 6, the silent work of monastic scribes, how margins filled our history section 1. The world of the scriptorium. When you think of the Middle Ages, you may imagine castles, knights, or plagues. But in truth, much of our knowledge of that era and of the centuries before survives because of men who lived in quiet seclusion, hunched over wooden desks, dipping quills into ink, and tracing letters onto parchment. These men were the monastic scribes, and their most important workplace was the scriptorium, the writing chamber of the monastery. The story of the scribes begins with the collapse of Roman authority in the West. When imperial schools and bureaucracies faltered in the 5th and 6th centuries, literacy declined outside elite circles. Yet monasteries, founded across Europe in the wake of Benedictine and other early monastic movements, became islands of learning. They offered a different kind of preservation, not grand libraries of marble halls, but simple wooden rooms where monks copied manuscripts by hand, line by line. The scriptorium was rarely glamorous. In many monasteries, it was a small, cold chamber with benches arranged around a central fire or oil lamp. Light was precious for candles, and oil were costly. Daylight streaming through narrow windows was the preferred illumination. Some larger abbeys, like those at Cluny or Monte Cassino, had dedicated writing halls with rows of desks and strict supervision. Smaller monasteries might assign only 1 or 2 monks to copying, perhaps in their cells or in a communal room, depending on space. The process of bookmaking was arduous. Parchment made from animal skins had to be scraped, stretched and prepared sometimes over weeks. Ink was brewed from oak galls and iron salts, creating a dark, durable stain. Quills were cut from goose feathers, sharpened with knives, and trimmed repeatedly throughout the day. Even the simple act of ruling lines on parchment with a lead stylus required patience, for without guidance, letters might drift unevenly across the page. The monks copied texts not simply for pleasure, but out of duty. Central to monastic life was the rule of Saint Benedict, which emphasized ora et labora, prayer and work. For many communities, copying manuscripts was as much a spiritual exercise as it was an intellectual one. To reproduce sacred texts, such as the Psalms or the Gospels, was to participate in divine service. A well-written page was not only a gift to future generations, but an offering to God. Yet not all manuscripts were strictly religious. Monks also preserved works of classical antiquity, Aristotle, Cicero, Ovid, and Virgil, alongside treatises on medicine, astronomy, and law. Without them, much of Greco-Roman knowledge might have vanished. A monk in an Irish abbey might copy a Latin poem he barely understood, trusting that the act of preservation was itself worthwhile. In this sense, the scribes were bridges between cultures and centuries, even when they worked in isolation from the world. Silence was the rule of the scriptorium. Monks took vows that limited speech, and in writing halls, silence was doubly necessary. The scratching of quills, the rustle of parchment, and the occasional cough or sigh were the soundtrack of centuries. Errors could creep in easily. A slip of the hand, a momentary distraction. So concentration was paramount. Some manuscripts contain tiny apologies from weary scribes in the margins. The hand that wrote, "This is tired." Others contain small jokes. "This parchment is too hairy," or "Thank God it will soon be dark." Margins themselves became curious spaces. While the main text was copied with care, monks sometimes left notes, doodles, or commentary at the edges. These marginalia tell us much about their personalities: whimsical sketches of animals, caricatures of fellow monks, or even complaints about the weather. Though the scribes lived lives of discipline, their pens betrayed humor and humanity at the edges of the page. It is easy, from our modern perspective, to see the work of scribes as monotonous. And indeed, many monks likely found it grueling. Hours bent over parchment strained the eyes and stiffened the back. The cold of unheated chambers numbed fingers in winter. The repetitive task offered little stimulation. And yet this very monotony is why it mattered in their patience and persistence. Scribes created continuity. They bridged centuries of turmoil and ensured that knowledge once nearly lost could resurface centuries later. The output of a single monastery could be staggering over time. An industrious scriptorium might produce dozens of manuscripts a year. Across Europe, this multiplied into thousands of volumes, slowly populating libraries. These were not mass-produced books, but singular, unique copies, often with subtle differences between them. Every text we have from antiquity that survived into the modern era passed through such hands. Each scribe was an unwitting link in the chain of human memory. And yet behind this vast achievement lies a subtle question. Did the scribes themselves know the importance of their task, or did they see it only as another duty among many? Were they aware that their silent toil was laying the foundation for Western intellectual history? Or did they believe themselves to be merely copying words in obedience to their abbot? The scriptorium was a quiet place, but within its silence, entire civilizations were preserved. As we close this first section, you may wonder, How did this work evolve from simple copying into something more ambitious, the creation of illuminated manuscripts where margins became canvases of color and gold? And what do those embellishments reveal about the mindset of monks who, despite vows of humility, could not resist adorning words with beauty? Section 2. Illuminating the Word, Art Margins, and the Unexpected Life of Texts. When we picture a medieval manuscript today, many of us imagine shimmering letters dusted with gold leaf, elaborate initials curling into vines and beasts, or entire pages flooded with color. This was the art of illumination, and though it grew from the same roots as plain copying, it represents a second life of the scribe's work, one where margins became playgrounds of expression, both sacred and mundane. At its core, illumination was still about preservation. To make a book striking and beautiful was to increase its value, ensuring it would be treasured and protected. A Bible adorned with gold was less likely to be discarded in hard times than a plain set of parchment sheets. Yet, beyond practicality, illumination also reflected a deeply spiritual impulse to honor the sacred word with physical splendor. To write was to serve God. To embellish the letters was to glorify Him even further. The process itself was meticulous. Once the text was copied, illuminators, often monks themselves, though sometimes specialists, hired by wealthy patrons, began their work. First, they planned spaces for initials, borders, or illustrations. Then they applied layers of pigment, often ground from minerals like lapis lazuli, malachite, and cinnabar. The most prized color, ultramarine, made from crushed lapis imported from Afghanistan, was more expensive than gold. Indeed, some letters gleamed with real gold leaf, beaten into fragile sheets and pressed onto glue-like adhesives. The shimmering effect would catch the eye even in candlelight, making the page appear almost divine. But not all embellishment was lofty. Margins, in particular, became curious zones of freedom. While the main text followed strict fidelity, the edges often reflected whimsy, satire, or commentary. A monk might copy a sermon on humility in the center of the page, while at the margin he doodled a rabbit riding a snail or a knight battling a giant slug. The juxtaposition is striking solemnity and silliness, sharing the same parchment. These images remind us that medieval scribes were not machines. They had humor, frustrations, and imaginations that spilled over into their work. Some marginalia appear to mock authority, poking fun at bishops, abbots, or even the texts themselves. Others reflect daily life drawings of kitchens, farm animals, or mischievous children. Still others are simply absurd, grotesque beasts, hybrid creatures, or abstract patterns. Scholars debate their meaning. Were they moments of private rebellion, spiritual allegories now lost to us? Or were they perhaps the medieval equivalent of doodling in the margins of a notebook, a way to break monotony during long hours of labor? Yet illumination was not only play, it also reinforced meaning. Large initials marked divisions in the text, guiding the reader through complex works. Decorative borders framed sacred passages, reminding the reader that this was no ordinary book. Whole page illustrations, known as miniatures, could condense theology into a single image. A scene of Christ enthroned, painted opposite the opening of a gospel, might have carried as much impact for a medieval monk as a long sermon. The rise of illuminated manuscripts also signaled a shift in audience. While early monastic scriptoria copied primarily for their own use, by the 12th and 13th centuries, manuscripts were increasingly commissioned by nobles, bishops, and wealthy lay patrons. Books of hours, devotional guides structured around the daily prayers of the church, became prized possessions of the aristocracy. These volumes, small enough to be carried, were often filled with lavish illumination. Their margins bloomed with flowers, saints, and coats of arms, but also, curiously, with playful animals and folk scenes. In this way, the private devotion of a countess or duke was shaped by the same hands that once worked in silence for the monastery. One might think that such embellishment distracted from the sacred task of preservation. Yet the two were intertwined. For every plain parchment copied in dim silence, another was adorned, increasing its chances of survival. The very beauty of illuminated manuscripts made them treasures to be guarded, passed down, and eventually housed in libraries. Without illumination, many works might have been discarded during Reform's wars or changing fashions. The gold and pigments, costly and rare, anchored the texts in permanence. Still, the act of illumination reveals something more subtle about monastic culture, its duality of discipline and creativity. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized obedience, humility, and constancy. Yet within the confines of the page, monks found room to express wit, artistry, and individuality. The margin became a liminal space at once secondary and central, overlooked yet enduring. Modern historians often find the margins more revealing than the texts themselves, for they preserve the personality of their creators in a way the central words could not. Even with this artistry, the life of the scribe was rarely glamorous. Gold leaf and exotic pigments were expensive and difficult to acquire. Not every monastery could afford them. In many cases, illumination was modest, a simple red initial, a few flourishes, perhaps a line of decorative script. For every richly illuminated Bible of a cathedral treasury, there were countless plainer psalters, sermons, and scholastic commentaries copied with little more than black ink. These humble books did the quiet work of transmitting knowledge, while their glamorous cousins dazzled and survived. In thinking about illumination, one cannot ignore the physical toll. Copying by hand strained the eyes, but painting with precision under dim light required an even steadier hand. The patience demanded was immense, and yet monks endured, leaving us a legacy of color and imagery that seems almost out of place with our stereotype of the Dark Middle Ages. But perhaps the most fascinating element of illumination is the question it raises. Did the scribes see themselves as artists or mere servants of the word? When a monk painted a gold leaf halo around a saint, did he feel pride in his artistry? Or was it swallowed into the humility demanded by his vows? And in the end, which mattered more, the text itself or the margin that gave it life? As we close this section, we leave the scriptorium full of color and light its margins, whispering humor and humanity alongside sacred texts. But as manuscripts multiplied and spread beyond monasteries into universities and courts, another question arises. How did this monastic tradition adapt when book production began to change? Especially with the arrival of the printing press in the 15th century. Section 3. From silent cells to printing presses. The waning but lasting echo of the scribes. By the 14th century, the work of monastic scribes was already changing. Universities had sprung up across Europe. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Salamanca, and with them came a demand for texts on law, medicine, theology, and philosophy. No longer was book production confined to monasteries. Professional scribes and lay workshops began to compete with, and in some cases overshadow, monastic scriptoria. Yet monasteries remained vital centers of copying, particularly for devotional works. Psalters, missals, and breviaries were still in demand. The Benedictines, Cistercians, and Carthusians continued to produce books, often with the same care and fidelity that had guided their predecessors for centuries. Still, the atmosphere was shifting. Books were becoming less rare, and their ownership spread beyond monasteries and cathedrals to wealthy merchants, lawyers, and scholars. Margins reflected this shift. While early monastic scribes filled them with whimsy, later manuscripts for urban clients often featured heraldic symbols, portraits of patrons, or practical glosses for study. In university circles, marginal notes were essential. Students and masters alike filled the sides of pages with commentary, cross-references, and arguments. What monks had once doodled in playful secrecy now became an institutionalized part of intellectual life. But the most dramatic change loomed in the mid-15th century with Johannes Gutenberg's movable type press. The first printed books, or incunabula, resembled manuscripts. Black letter type mimicked the strokes of a quill, and blank spaces were often left for initials to be hand-painted. Some even had margins wide enough to encourage annotations. Yet the underlying reality was unmistakable. What once took a monk months to copy could now be reproduced in days. The press did not merely add efficiency, it transformed the very economics of knowledge. For monastic scribes, this was both a relief and a loss. Relief because the burden of endless copying was lightened. Loss because the labor that had once been their sacred calling was slipping away. Scriptoria dwindled. Some monasteries ceased book production altogether, purchasing printed volumes instead. Others adapted, redirecting their energies toward illumination. For a time, illuminators continued to decorate printed books, blending old craft with new technology. But gradually, even this became less common, as demand for practical, affordable texts outweighed the luxury of embellishment. Still, scribes did not vanish overnight. Some monasteries maintained their traditions well into the 16th century, continuing to hand-copy texts for ceremonial or archival purposes. And, even as their role diminished the skills they had preserved, calligraphy, attention to detail, care for the written word, fed into new professions. Many former scribes found employment as proofreaders, editors, or illuminators for early printers. The transition was uneven, but it revealed continuity as much as rupture. Perhaps more enduring than the scribes themselves was the culture they created around the page. Margins once filled with doodles and glosses lived on in printed books as spaces for notes and commentary. Modern scholars often write in the margins of their texts, echoing a practice nearly a millennium old. Even the formatting of books' chapters, headings, paragraph marks, reflects systems developed by medieval scribes to make texts easier to navigate. Their silent labor also left a mark on our sense of time. The slow rhythm of copying letter by letter reinforced an appreciation of the written word that persists even in our digital era. When we pause over a handwritten note or admire calligraphy, we engage with a tradition rooted in the quiet cloisters of monasteries. There is a temptation to view the scribe's work as obsolete once printing arrived, but this overlooks their deeper legacy. Without centuries of careful copying, there would have been little for printers to reproduce. Classical texts, the Church Fathers, local chronicles, medical treatises, all survived because anonymous monks bent over desks in cold scriptoria, sacrificing comfort to preserve words they might barely have understood. In this sense, the printing press was not the end of their work, but its culmination. Even their marginal doodles, once idle amusements, now serve as unexpected windows into the medieval mind. They remind us that history is never only solemn. Alongside the grandeur of cathedrals and the authority of kings, there was always laughter, boredom, and creativity scribbled in the margins. These tiny figures of rabbits jousting, or monks grumbling in verse bridge the centuries with startling intimacy. As we consider the scribe's legacy, one question lingers. What would have been lost without them, without their discipline? Perhaps the works of Aristotle would have vanished in Europe, never fueling the Renaissance. Without their margins, perhaps we would imagine medieval monks as joyless automatons, rather than human beings with humor and imagination. Without their silence, perhaps our modern sense of the book as a vessel of permanence would never have taken root. The press may have closed the age of the scribe, but it did not erase their voice. It only amplified it, carrying their preserved texts further than they could ever have imagined. In this way, the quiet scratches of quills on parchment became the foundation of global literacy. And so, when you next turn the page of a book, it is worth remembering that you are participating in a lineage that stretches back to those cloisters. Somewhere in a dimly lit cell, a monk leaned over parchment, filling not only the center with sacred words, but also the margins with fragments of humanity. Their silent work endures not only in what we read, but in how we read. Perhaps the most fitting reflection is this: if the printing press democratized knowledge, it was the scribes who first safeguarded it. And without their seemingly monotonous, boring devotion, the story of our civilization might have been written or lost very differently. Story 7. Bricks, Mortar and Mud, The Lifespan of Forgotten Houses, Section 1. Shaping the Earth into Shelter. The Origins of Mud and Brick Homes. When we think of the ancient world, we often picture temples, pyramids, or fortresses, the structures that endure, because they were designed to defy time. But in truth, the great majority of people throughout history lived in houses made of far more modest materials: mud, clay, straw, and later bricks bound together with simple mortars. These homes, so ordinary and fragile, once filled entire towns and villages. Their remnants often lie hidden beneath layers of soil because the very materials that sheltered families for centuries were also destined to crumble back into the earth. The earliest evidence of people shaping mud into homes goes back to the Neolithic era, when settled farming communities began to appear around 10,000 years ago. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of wattle and daub structures in sites such as Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, dating to around 7000 BCE. These early houses were simple rectangles or circles made by weaving branches into frames, then smearing them with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. The dung served as a binder, making the walls less likely to crack. When dry, they provided a surprisingly sturdy shelter against wind and weather. The innovation of the mud brick, taking earth, mixing it with water and straw, shaping it into blocks, and leaving it to dry in the sun, was revolutionary. Mud bricks allowed for more uniform solid construction. In Mesopotamia, by around 5000 BCE, entire cities rose from such bricks. The Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians all lived surrounded by mud brick homes, and even their monumental ziggurats were essentially stacks of millions of sun-dried bricks. Though the outer layers of temples and palaces were often faced with fired bricks or stone, the cores were still mud brick. Ordinary houses clustered in neighborhoods with narrow, winding streets were made entirely of this material. The choice of mud brick was practical. The soil of the Tigris and Euphrates floodplains provided endless supplies of silt and clay. Straw from nearby fields gave the mixture strength, while the arid climate ensured bricks dried quickly in the sun. Construction was communal families, and neighbors gathered to mix mold and stack bricks, often reusing materials from older crumbling homes. The lifespan of a mud brick house was short, sometimes only a few decades before walls needed rebuilding. But this was expected. A house was not imagined as a permanent monument. It was a living structure, maintained generation by generation. Egypt, too, was a land of mud brick. While stone temples and pyramids dominate our imagination, Most Egyptians lived in mud brick homes. Villages like Deir el-Medina, built for workers on the royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings, reveal rows of modest rectangular houses. Inside walls were coated with mud plaster and sometimes painted with simple designs. Flat roofs, supported by wooden beams, doubled as living spaces. Families often slept on the roof in hot weather or stored grain in jars against the wall. In the Indus Valley, civilization at sites like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa c. 2600 to 1900 BCE baked bricks were more common, fired in kilns for greater durability. Streets were lined with brick houses, some 2 stories tall, connected to sophisticated drainage systems. Here, bricks became standardized in size, showing an early move toward urban planning. The uniformity of these homes reflects a society that valued order and function over luxury in its domestic spaces. In China, early homes of the Yellow River Valley were often dug partly into the ground, with walls reinforced by mud bricks or rammed earth, another technique where moist soil was compacted in layers inside wooden frames. Rammed earth walls could be remarkably strong and thick, capable of lasting centuries if maintained. This method eventually scaled up to fortifications like sections of the Great Wall, but its origins were humble in village dwellings. Across Europe, mud and timber dominated. Wattle and daub cottages plastered with limewash to keep out rain dotted medieval landscapes. Roofs of thatch added insulation, but also a constant risk of fire. Archaeological traces in Britain, Germany, and Scandinavia reveal how common such structures were, though little remains today, except soil discolorations and post holes, the ghostly outlines of vanished homes. What unites these traditions is their ordinariness. Mud, straw, clay, and wood were accessible to all, and houses built from them were woven into cycles of renewal and decay. Families expected to repair, rebuild, and sometimes abandon their homes when walls weakened. To us, this impermanence may seem like fragility. To them, it was simply the rhythm of life. Yet these humble houses shaped civilizations. They allowed people to settle, to farm, to raise children, and to build communities. They gave form to daily routines, grinding grain in a corner, cooking over a clay hearth, storing food in jars sealed with mud. If palaces and temples were the symbols of power, mud brick houses were the fabric of survival. And so the question lingers, if so much of human life was lived in these fragile, temporary structures, how much of our history has simply melted back into the earth, leaving only faint impressions, where once whole neighborhoods thrived? Section 2, Maintenance, Repair, and the slow decay of domestic walls. When a house is built of stone, it projects permanence. It is meant to outlast the generations that dwell inside. But houses made of mud, straw, and unfired brick tell a different story, one of fragility, of constant attention, and of acceptance that decay is inevitable. In the world of mud brick and mortar, the building of a home was never truly finished. It was an ongoing process, a cycle of maintenance and renewal that mirrored the cycles of the seasons and of life itself. In Mesopotamia, where mud brick was the material of choice for thousands of years, the expectation of decay was built into the culture. Rain, though scarce, was devastating when it came. A sudden storm could soften bricks, washing away outer layers of a wall. Roofs, often made of timber covered with reeds and clay, leaked, if not frequently patched. Archaeologists examining surviving walls of ancient houses have noted layer upon layer of plaster, each applied as a new coat of protection against water. Families would spend part of their year re-smearing mud plaster over cracked surfaces, a chore as essential as baking bread or tending livestock. When walls became too weak, bricks could be removed and remolded. This recycling of materials was not only practical, but expected. In some cities, archaeologists have uncovered evidence that neighborhoods were rebuilt on the same plots repeatedly, new houses rising atop the ruins of old ones. Over centuries, this practice created mounds, known as tells, artificial hills, composed of stacked layers of collapsed homes. Entire cities like ancient Troy, or became stratified records of domestic renewal, each generation layering their existence on top of the last. In Egypt, the hot, arid climate helped preserve mud brick houses, but they were still prone to erosion and collapse. A neglected wall might crumble back into dust within a single flood season, if near the Nile. The workers' village of Deir el-Medina shows how Egyptians combated this. Houses there reveal evidence of small, but constant repairs, bricks inserted into cracked walls, plaster smoothed over irregular joints doorways, shored up with additional wood or stone supports. Roof beams prone to termite damage were often replaced with whatever timber could be obtained. Egypt lacked large forests, so beams were valuable, and sometimes salvaged from older houses, or even dismantled tombs. In medieval Europe, the challenges were different but no less constant. Wattle and daub walls cracked in winter frosts, warped in damp and sagged under heavy thatch roofs. Families frequently redaubed their walls, mixing mud straw and dung in the same way their ancestors had. Limewash, a chalky white coating, not only brightened the appearance of cottages, but also sealed against moisture and pests. Applying it was an annual ritual in many villages, a task that might involve the whole household. The smell of wet lime, sharp and mineral, was the scent of maintenance, a reminder that homes were not permanent shelters, but living, breathing structures that needed attention. In the Indus Valley, where baked bricks were more common, maintenance was less about crumbling walls and more about managing drainage and structural integrity. Excavations at Mohenjo-Daro reveal carefully laid brickwork, but also evidence of later repairs where walls were reinforced or floors raised. The city was prone to flooding, so residents periodically elevated their homes, stacking new bricks atop old foundations. These repairs tell a story of resilience, a city that refused to abandon its location despite the recurring challenges of water. In rural China, homes made from rammed earth required different care. Walls could be thick, sometimes more than a meter, but cracks inevitably spread through them as the soil shifted. Repair involved packing fresh layers of earth into the cracks, tamping it down to restore solidity. Wooden supports were often added, but wood rotted quickly in damp regions. Here, too, roofs required constant repair as tiles slipped or thatch decayed. Chinese records mention families pooling resources to maintain each other's homes, a reminder that house maintenance was as much social as practical. The process of repair was not just about keeping out rain and wind. It was about survival in a broader sense. A house was a storehouse for food, a barrier against disease, and a marker of status in the community. A crumbling wall might signal neglect, poverty, or misfortune. Conversely, a freshly plastered exterior could indicate diligence and pride. In some societies, maintenance became a ritual duty imbued with moral or spiritual meaning. To keep a house sound was to show respect for ancestors and care for descendants. Over time, however, even the most careful repairs could not prevent eventual collapse. Roof beams sagged until they broke. Walls bowed outward until they toppled. When this happened, families faced a choice: rebuild on the same spot or move elsewhere. Often the decision came down to the quality of the surrounding land. In fertile valleys, people rebuilt endlessly, layering new homes over old. In less generous environments, collapse might mean abandonment. Entire villages could vanish, leaving only faint traces, discolored soil, where post holes once stood, or shards of pottery buried in the dirt. From the perspective of archaeology, this cycle of repair and collapse is frustrating and illuminating in equal measure. So much has been lost: the wooden beams, the straw roofs, the plaster coatings. Yet in the rubble and debris, the story of maintenance survives. In the ruins of a Mesopotamian house, a small patch of plaster may show the very handprint of the person who applied it. In medieval cottages, layers of lime wash reveal decades of reapplication, one coat over another. These fragments whisper of the daily labor that kept walls standing long enough to shelter lives. What emerges is a picture of housing, not as a static achievement, but as an ongoing conversation between people and the elements. Every crack filled every roof, patched every wall rebuilt, was a reminder that nature always pressed against human effort. The home was never won once and for all. It had to be reclaimed season after season from the forces that sought to take it back. And so the lingering question remains, when so many lives were bound to the endless cycle of building, repairing, and watching walls decay. Did people of the past see their homes as fragile shelters? Or did they accept impermanence as the very foundation of domestic life? Section 3. The ruins beneath our feet. When we look at the past, we often imagine castles, temples, or monuments, the great works of kings and empires. Yet most people lived not in stone towers or marble halls, but in houses of mud timber and straw. These houses were built quickly, lived in briefly, repaired often, and eventually collapsed. What is left of them today is faint little more than outlines in the earth foundations of brick, or impressions of posts long since rotted away. And yet these ruins, humble as they may seem, tell us as much about history as the grandest palace. Archaeologists often speak of negative space, the traces of what is no longer there. A house of wood and mud, once vibrant with life, becomes only stains in the soil where posts were driven in, or a line of darker earth where a wall once stood. In some ancient sites, floors of packed clay remain, showing the worn paths of footsteps across a threshold. Hearths appear as circles of ash, blackened earth that once warmed meals and bodies. Pottery fragments scatter where shelves collapsed. A child's toy, a spindle whorl, or a broken bead might survive in the dirt, hinting at ordinary lives otherwise lost. In Mesopotamian tells, the accumulation of collapsed houses built history upward. Each layer of debris, brick dust pottery, shard splintered wood was leveled, then built over. To excavate such a mound is to peel back centuries of domestic life. Archaeologists find staircases that once led to rooftops, courtyards lined with drains, walls painted in faded red or blue. But always between layers there are signs of destruction: roofs caved in by storms, walls undermined by floods, or deliberate demolition to clear space for rebuilding. The cycle of life and collapse is written in the very soil. In medieval Europe, little remains of peasant cottages, but documentary records sometimes supplement the archaeology. Manorial rolls list tenants who paid for timber to repair a roof, or who were fined for neglecting to maintain a boundary wall. These small notations, dry as they seem, reveal the rhythm of ordinary housing, the yearly need for straw, the periodic replacement of wattle, fencing, the cost of lime for plastering. Together, they paint a picture of communities where housing was fragile, but never neglected. To own a house was not to possess permanence, but to commit to unending maintenance. Egypt, with its arid climate, preserves some of the most vivid remains. Entire workers' villages, such as Deir el-Medina, have survived their mud brick walls, still standing to shoulder height after 3,000 years. Walking through them today, you can trace narrow alleys, step through doorways, and imagine the shade cast by roofs now gone. Here, the cycle of decay slowed enough for traces to survive, offering us a rare glimpse into ordinary architecture. And yet, even these houses, better preserved than most, remind us that mud brick returns to dust unless watched over. Their survival is an accident of climate, not of design. In China's north, abandoned rammed earth homes melt slowly back into the fields. Farmers plowing land sometimes cut through walls centuries old, the packed earth no longer distinguishable from the soil around it. In South Asia, the sites of ancient villages appear as low mounds, where baked bricks poke out of the ground, reused by later generations for new construction. The houses themselves are gone, yet the footprints remain in the organization of space, the way streets curve, courtyards align, or drainage channels flow. What all these remnants share is silence. Unlike monuments which declare the power of rulers or temples, which proclaim devotion to gods, houses leave behind only whispers. Yet those whispers are vital. They remind us that history was not only the story of conquest and kingship, but of families patching roofs, smearing plaster, fetching straw, and accepting that their walls would one day fall. If there is a lesson in these forgotten houses, it is that permanence is not the natural state of human life. For most of history, people built with what was near at hand, mud reeds, wood straw, knowing that these materials would not last. What mattered was not durability, but continuity, the passing down of knowledge about how to build again, how to repair, how to recycle old bricks into new walls. Civilization endured, not because houses stood forever, but because people accepted the need to build anew. Today, when concrete and steel promise longevity, it is easy to overlook the fragility that defined domestic life for millennia. Yet, beneath modern cities, beneath our roads and towers, lie the remains of countless forgotten houses, each one a reminder that permanence is an illusion. What survives is not the wall itself, but the memory of the hands that shaped it. So the story of bricks, mortar, and mud ends, not with the collapse of walls, but with a reflection. The houses are gone, but the people who built them left their mark in the very soil beneath our feet. And perhaps the question they leave us is this: when our own buildings have fallen centuries from now, what traces of our daily lives will remain for others to find? As we have moved through these 7 stories, a pattern has emerged. Much of the past is not written in battles, kings, or monuments, but in the small, repetitive, and often overlooked details of daily life. Wooden sticks carved by Vikings, the tax ledgers of ancient Egypt, the labor of washing clothes without soap, the salt roads that bound economies together, the hidden adjustments of calendars, the margins filled by monastic scribes, and the fragile houses of mud and timber. All of these belong to history, just as surely as crowns or armies. What they share is patience. Anonymous hands wrote notes, patched roofs carried salt, mixed mortar, copied texts, or hauled laundry water. They never imagined their work would be remembered yet. It was these quiet acts that kept societies functioning, preserved knowledge, and allowed time itself to continue. The final lesson is simple. Though easily forgotten, history is not built only on greatness, but on the persistence of small things. The routines of ordinary people repeated across generations made survival possible. Without them, no empire, no faith, no invention could have endured. So, as you close this journey, consider the unnoticed details around you. For it may be the mundane, the things most easily overlooked, that future generations will uncover, and in them, find the true story of our time.